Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. The show today is going to be a follow on to the last show that I did and kind of a prelude to the next show that I'm going forward on. I was looking at a map of countries with cousin to cousin marriages, and I noticed a huge thing. The Middle East, over that area over there, Gulf states, has the largest percentage of cousin to cousin marriages in the entire world. Africa is, of course, in the mix. It took me a little bit of time to figure out how did Africa get in there. Well, they split up Africa before they split up the Middle East. That Sykes-Picot, that followed what happened to Africa. The scramble to Africa happened before the Middle East, so that is likely how Africa got in the picture also. So I kept thinking about, when all that Sykes-Picot business broke up during that region, same time as those Romanovs and the Habsburgs went away. Kind of a interesting coincidence, right? I think what happened was they just installed some of their own clan members into the deal over in the Gulf states. Same way the mafia operates. Family members are involved, just like gypsy clans. The entire family chain works together. So what is this? It's called the bint marriage, or marriage with one's father's brother's daughter. Is especially common, especially in tribal and traditional Muslim communities, where men and women seldom meet potential spouses outside the extended family. Rates of cousin marriage in the Middle East have been found to vary from 29% in Egypt to nearly 58% in Saudi Arabia. Are you starting to get the sense this sounds a little bit like those Ashkenazi Jews and their big issues? Huh. If you're getting that sense, you're on the right trail. There's an interesting thing that I've been talking about for a long time, and I'd like to introduce it here again. Especially online, the word inversion is often used to describe victims being blamed, institutions presenting themselves as moral while committing harm, power structures making exploitation beyond virtual language. When everything starts to see the same, right? You feel like you're in an upside down world. That's called inversion. Everything is backwards. A peace prize, for example, given to someone engaged in war policy. Barack Obama got a peace thing from the Nobel Peace Prize. Trump is dying to get one as they keep murdering more people. That, in fact, would be what we're talking about. Or a child protection institution covering up abuse. Or a wellness brand harming their own followers. So when people say satanic is inversion, that's where it comes from. Satan. They usually mean a system that presents itself as good while operating in morally reversed ways. So let's get a few of these words out of the way first so we can get on the right track here. There's a word called apostasy, apostasy, is a formal abandonment or renunciation of a religion that a person previously identified with. So if you do apostasy, that means that you formally abandon or renounce the religion that you personally previously identified with, okay? So apostasy means leaving your religion. The word comes from the Greek meaning defection or standing away from. And this is the part that really, well, I never thought that you could join a religion and then be forced to stay and you couldn't leave. Kind of sound like a cult to me. So, how do we understand this apostasy business? Well, in religious doctrine, apostasy usually means consciously rejecting core beliefs, publicly renouncing the faith, or converting to another religion, or declaring disbelief. And different religions define it differently. So, but in certain churches, in certain countries, apostasy can mean it can be actually a criminal offense, like you can't leave that church. A civil statute issue affecting marriage, inheritance, and custody, or a ground for social punishment. But in most secular democracies, leaving a religion is fully protected under freedom of belief. So, even when legal penalties don't exhibit or exist, apostasy can result in family rejection, community ostracizing, social isolation. So, it can be a pretty big thing. So, let's take a look at how some of these religions view apostasy. Islam traditionally treated apostasy as a serious offense in classical jurisprudence, often linked historically to political rebellion. Modern Muslim majority countries vary widely in enforcement. And the Christians also use this stuff, but they used it way earlier on, and so did the Jews, and so did the Hindus and the Buddhists. But so the Hindus and the Buddhists generally do not have a centralized doctrine having death penalties for apostasy. But what happens is this is that in some places, speaking of places I'll be talking about today, if you said the following, I no longer believe, I am no longer Muslim, Christian, Jewish, etc. I now follow a different religion. That is apostasy from the original faith. So, what happens in these different countries? Well, let's take a look at Afghanistan under the Taliban rule. Apostasy is considered a capital offense under Taliban interpretation of Sharia. Public renunciation can result in imprisonment or execution. In Saudi Arabia, no specific no specific no specific apostasy statute, but apostasy can be prosecuted under anti-terror or blasphemy frameworks. For example, promoting atheism has been categorized under extremist laws, and public renunciation is legally quite dangerous in those countries. Pakistan, apostasy itself is not clearly codified as a separate crime. However, blasphemy laws are extremely strict and carry potential death penalties, and social violence or mob action is a major risk factor if you decide to denounce your religion. And in Brunei, under expanded Sharia penal code, apostasy can theoretically carry severe punishment, including death. So, what is going on with this? In many Muslim majority countries, leaving Islam is not formally illegal, but civil law may make it difficult to change religious identity on official documents. Family law, marriage, inheritance, custody may penalize you for taking the apostasy route. Social retaliation, disownment of your family, and violence may occur. For example, in Tunisia, Morocco, Lebanon, and Jordan, legal punishment is unlikely, but public renunciations can trigger social and economic consequences. And the countries where it's fully legal to give up your religion, well, who do we have here? The United States, Canada, and most of Europe. So, leaving Islam is fully protected under freedom of religious laws in those places. So, in some countries, yes, it is potentially punishable by prison or death to leave Islam. In others, it may be not illegal but socially dangerous. And in secular democracies, it's fully legal and protected. So, how did this all get started? Well, I found it originally started with a loyalty to the Roman gods, and the imperial cult was used to citizenship. And back in that time, refusal to participate, like the early Christians, could result in execution. While not apostasy in a doctrinal sense, abandoning state religion was treated as subversion. So there's a lot to all of this business with all this religion stuff, right? So let's take a look at how exactly did this get started. That's where it gets very interesting. Prior to the origins of Islam, cousin marriage was an acceptable practice in the Middle East, according to writings in the Bible. Abraham sent his servant back to back to his brother to get a wife for his son Isaac. Isaac eventually married his first cousin once removed, Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the son of Nahor, and Abraham's brother. So, evidently, it came from the Bible, right? And you know what I think about that Bible? The Bible is their, let's call it the movie script for all of this, right? So, then it comes from the Quran in the holy book of Islam. And a lot of people think the Quran is real and hasn't been adulterated because it's not that big and so has protected it. Toss all that out the window, okay? Everything has been co opted. Absolutely everything. So, in the holy book of Islam, the Quran, they give a very fairly detailed list of what sort of marriages are prohibited in Islam, including your father's sisters and your mother's sisters and brother's daughters and sisters' daughters and your foster mothers, but does not include first cousins. Now, isn't that so handy, right? They left off the first cousins and ends by saying, lawful to you are all beyond these. So, pious Muslims took the life of the Islamic prophet Muhammad and early Muslims as examples to be followed. One of Muhammad's wives, Zabnya bint Jahishi, was the daughter of Muhammad's aunt. However, Muhammad had no children with Zainab, only with, well, it gets a little tangled here. So here's the bottom line. The Quranic law dictating that daughters receive a portion of the inheritance appears to have provided a financial incentive to cousin marriage, as the inheritance would remain in the extended family. So, according to a 2012 question, this Islamic preacher said that the Quran does not forbid cousin marriage, but quote somebody else as saying that Muhammad says, do not marry generation after generation among first cousins. Yes, and that's what they're doing, right? So, anyhow, I don't know why I moved this down here, but anyway, so that is what the laws are and how this cousin marriage works around the world. And it can get pretty brutal if you say, I don't want to be a practice Islam anymore. Well, things might get pretty rough for you. So let's take a look at where we are today. Today we're talking about, well, all this business with the incest. But before we get there, I want to explain a little bit about these Epstein photos. I think this is called payback time. You notice that none of these photos have pictures of any boys, just girls, just men in the files, no women. Blackmail means they turn on each other. Photos are another opportunity for them to turn on each other more. So, do you really think those photos are just being released just randomly? We have 3 million photos. We're just going to redact a few. We just release them all. You really think the very same people who believe in setting up other people in horrendous ways and blackmailing them would not be using these photos as one more opportunity to blackmail more people? Just something to think about. People today on social media run around saying, well, we think maybe Epstein's not even dead. Well, hey, geniuses, he hasn't been dead for a long time. He's probably hanging around Israel right now. So let's take a look at why would I be suggesting that this is payback time. And I'll be talking about a particular UAE guy here in a second. Because these people always turn on each other. Have you noticed that? They always are after each other. They hate each other. They're venomous as far as how they feel about each other. So, who is exactly in charge of these Epstein pictures that are getting released? Well, funny you should ask. Well, there's a woman named Pam Bondi, but she is the face. Who works for Pam Bondi that we should be concerned about? Well, funny you should ask that question too. Todd Blanche, Blanche. He reports to Pam Bondi. He formerly served as one of Trump's personal lawyers in his New York criminal cases, has played a role in the government's handling of Epstein related matters. Blanche, as in Todd Blanche, is the Deputy Attorney General, the number two at the DOJ, and he has been involved in the Trump administration's handling of the Epstein's files. Reporting indicates he personally participated in high profile meetings and interviews tied to the Epstein files, including interviews with Ghislaine Maxwell. His involvement has drawn scrutiny because of his prior role as Trump's defense attorney, raising concern from legal observers about potential conflicts of interest in how the administration manages sensitive case material. So, the official responsible for that effort within the executive branch is the Attorney General Pam Bondi. And operational work is being led at the DOJ level by career prosecutor and senior officials like Todd Blanche. So, where do they drag Bondi up from? Well, excuse me. I don't know why no one ever asked these questions, but I find all these details fascinating. Pam Bondi worked as a partner in the lobbying firm Ballard Partners after leaving public office in Florida. Among her clients was a GEO Group, one of the largest private prison and detention facility operators in the United States. And I'll be getting back to this prison stuff in a bit here, maybe down the road, but not today. But the United States has a very clear and long history in locking people up. I'll be getting more into that, and these private prisons will play a monstrous role. So, anyway, so Pam Bondi was represented the GEO Group, one of the largest private prisons, okay? And critics, of course, highlight the GEO Group's history of safety violations, poor conditions in facilities, and significant revenue from federal and state contracts, including immigration detention. So while Pam Bondi was at Ballard Partners, she also lobbied on behalf of multiple major U.S. corporations, not just private prison interests. She lobbied for Amazon, the e commerce and tech giant with extensive federal legislation regulatory interests. She lobbied for Uber, a major transportation network company advocating on labor and regulatory issues. She lobbied for General Motors, automotive manufacturer with federal policy interests. So, Bondi also is registered as a foreign agent. And this is where it gets interesting. That's why I always say, look at how it got started. And looky here, Pam Bondi also registered as a foreign agent. She lobbied on behalf of the government of Qatar. I couldn't make this stuff up if I spent the next 100 years. So she lobbied on behalf of the government of Qatar. Maybe she's got a beef against a UAE guy, but I'll get to that in a second here. So she lobbied on the behalf of Qatar with anti human trafficking initiatives related to the FIFA World Cup deal. She represented KGL Investment Company, a Kuwaiti investment entity, on issues like immigration policy and human rights. So, these former lobbying roles became points of contention during Bondi's confirmation as Attorney General, with critics arguing that her past advocacy for private corporations, foreign governments, and private prison operatives could pose conflicts of interest while shaping or enforcing federal law, particularly if the Department of Justice were to address issues related to those industries or their policy goals. Huh, kind of a conflict, huh? So, Pam Bondi's pre appointment work included representing private prison operators and a range of major corporate and foreign clients. So, let's talk about the UAE guy that showed up in the files. Oh, I won't be able to pronounce his name, and frankly, I don't care. I'll just call him the UAE guy. Sultan Ahmed, blah, blah, the UAE guy, also known as the UAE guy. So I'll just call him Sultan. That sounds good. Sultan, a prominent Emirati billionaire and longtime chairman and CEO of logistics giant DP World, based in the UAE, has become the central UAE figure in the Epstein files. Gee, maybe Pam Bondi is doing a little bit of payback time here. Huh, you think so? So, newly unsealed U.S. government documents show emails and extended correspondence between the Sultan guy and Jeffrey Epstein spanning years, including after Epstein's 2008 conviction. And the one that I like the most shows the character of this Sultan. It was from Epstein saying, I love the torture videos. Yes, implying that he evidently sent Epstein some torture videos. Emails reportedly include explicit sexual reference, personal details, and discussion of women or sexual encounters. Some stories claim the Sultan facilitated introductions or connections between Epstein and other powerful people. So, what does this DP world do? Well, this is a part that I found fascinating. I never knew this. I thought for some reason that when you went to a port or let's say, customs and all these terminals and all that stuff, I thought they were run A to Z by the government, right? So when you enter that port, the government's running it all. Well, actually, that is absolutely not true. What happens is that in these big ports and stuff, there's a portion, a very interesting portion that gets actually vended out to contractors to handle. So this guy was in a pretty interesting position. Pretty interesting to take down also. Now I'm just guessing. I don't talk to these people. Are they really after this guy? Yeah, if I was this Sultan dude, I'd think, hey, they're after me. Full stop. So the UAE, primarily through DP World, operates dozens globally. And the DP World is ultimately owned by the government of Dubai, which is part of the ruling leadership of the Emirate of Dubai and by extension, deeply connected to the UAE federal structure. So I did a quick look around. I'd like to get back to these ports one day. I never imagined. I knew they were crime scenes, but I didn't know that the criminals own part of the port. So let's take a look at my favorite port over there in Amsterdam. It's Europe's second largest port. I have talked endlessly about this port because that is the connection point where all of the filth and stuff is being handled and headed straight up through Belgium and into Europe. Good morning, Brussels. How you guys doing over there today? So anyway, so let's focus on just that port. Europe's second largest port handles millions of containers per year, a primary gateway into Germany, France, Netherlands, and inland Europe. Yes, this indeed, my friends, is where all of your filth and garbage is coming from. It is a major entry point for cocaine from Latin America, a hub for organized crime infiltration of dock labor, a focus of EU anti narcotics enforcement. So, Antwerp has become Europe's largest cocaine seizure site in years. You imagine how much really gets through, right? Less than 5% gets inspected. You pay off the right people, most of it goes through. And I'm going to venture to say that if your shipment gets seized, it's probably because you're competing with their shipments. You think you're going to get fancy and fast and get in the cocaine business? They'll fix you at the ports. You'll be the one that'll get nabbed at that port. Now, remember, I don't work at ports. I'm just guessing here, right? Maybe all these years of covering psychopaths have given me a little bit of insight. So ports are attractive for crime. They have sealed containers, minimal inspections, often less than 5% get scanned, complex ownership chains, rapid transshipments. So the modern port system is highly consolidated, infrastructure heavy, long term concession based, often state linked. So who else is in the port business? Well, China and Singapore arguably have even larger strategic footprints, but we're just going to focus on Dubai. And Dubai is commercial but politically strategic. Having that port allows them to focus on logistic corridors linking the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and India. If those routes sound familiar, well, they took them over from the British. So they have a very big interest in that part of the country. And the fascinating part is I find all of this transaction stuff, these routes and stuff, to be as fascinating as the rest of the stuff, how these psychos are moving this stuff around. So, yeah, so they just took over the old British routes, okay? It is the shortest, most efficient trade route between Europe, India, and East Africa. But the route still passes through the Suez, the Red Sea, the Gulf, and the Arabian Sea. So Britain exploited it militarily, Dubai exploits it commercially. So the major crime in Antwerp, cocaine trafficking, organized crime infiltration of dock labor, containers concealment technique. And this was the same thing that Daphne was writing about. Daphne that got car bombed and from Malta. She was writing about financial flows connected to Dubai based entities, offshore companies, and the Maltese political figure. Her reporting and later investigative journalism referenced use of UAE based bank accounts, transfers routed through Dubai intermediaries, corporate vehicles registered in UAE free zones. And one thing in Daphne's files I'd like to point you through, I don't have the answer, but everybody needs to start looking. There was a group that Daphne referenced that I haven't been able to really track down. It's called 17 Black. So that comes out of that area, and I do not have the answer for that, but somehow the 17 Black ties back into what Daphne was looking into and these UAE people. So, according to them, they claim there's very little evidence of large scale human trafficking occurring through these things, just mainly the drugs. I don't believe that for a second. I believe there is human trafficking coming through these ports, but not the subject for today. I've talked a lot about this out at China Lake. They have all those kids in cages and stuff. So to show you how polluted this whole Islam thing is, that black cube they sit around? Well, I'm going to try to be as respectful as I can, okay? If you're practicing Muslim, please do not take offense at what I'm about to say. I believe, and because I believe this does not mean that you have to believe it. And it does not mean that you have to call me stupid or crazy for believing it. It means we should open this conversation. It means we should take a closer look at how this stuff got started. I believe these things were cooked up. So, yeah, they want people studying the Quran and the Bible and all this stuff. This is about eugenics. This is the last chapter between good and evil. Basically, what they've done is the world is set up into kill boxes. That's what these wars are all about. And then along the way, it's about emasculating the men. And I'll have a lot more about the men down the road here. They needed to take the men off of the game board. So they did all kinds of things to them, and that included the circumcision, which I've already talked a lot about. The idea of circumcision that came from old Egypt, our gypsy friends. That's the furthest back I can find it. It shows that circumcision being performed likely functioned as a puberty initiation ritual, a marker of priestly or elite status. Yeah, those were the ones getting circumcised in, supposedly, or a cleanliness practice in hot climates. So Egypt influenced the Levant and parts of Northeast Africa culturally. So by the time Islam emerged in the 7th century CE, circumcision was already established in parts of North and East Africa. And then, of course, I talked about this in the show about circumcision. The show concluded that the Muslim Brotherhood was involved. Well, where'd the Muslim Brotherhood come from that started this whole circumcision thing going? Well, they came, I would suggest, out of the UK, because the Muslim Brotherhood, which spread this circumcision idea, began in 1928. That was 97 or 100 years ago. But you have to take a further look. So why am I so suspicious about the Muslim Brotherhood and all this circumcision business being cooked up? Well, because they claim it came out of Egypt, right? So where was Egypt in the 1920s? Well, Egypt was formally independent in 1922, but still heavily influenced by Britain. They were experiencing Western cultural penetration. They were undergoing rapid modernization and social change. They were politically unstable and divided. And that was where this whole idea came from the Muslim Brotherhood who came out of Egypt. So Egypt in the 1928s, they had formal independence, but Britain still controlled the Suez Canal, the military presence, and significant political leverages. So, excuse me. So, yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood were heavily influenced by the British. So, did the whole idea about circumcision that supposedly came from Muslim Brotherhood really come from the British? This is to demasculize the males. If you get the males so they're feeling less than, well, who's going to protect the women? Who's going to take care of the rest of the things? And that's why they then turn the women to turn against the men. This is just sheer divide and conquer from the very start. So, in digging through some of these things, one thing came out again. People are talking in the UK as far as should they resign the crown and Prince William take over. I got a better idea. Throw them all out. Throw them all out. And here is what also came out of these Epstein files. Central and Eastern Europe functioned as Epstein's primary recruitment zone. Yes, Central and Eastern Europe, with Poland, especially Warsaw, operating as a logistical hub that funneled girls from poorer regions through Paris or New York to final destinations, using model agencies, direct village scouting, and promises of education and housing as the bait. Yeah, they sure seem to love that area, don't they? Oh, in the last show, I didn't say where the money went, but the US took 500 million, which was the first Venezuelan oil sales, and I said in the last show they deposited in a bank in the Gulf states. I left off the name of the place. It was deposited in Dubai. Let me see. Gulf state, and the state was not Dubai or yeah, excuse me, it was not Dubai or the U, but Qatar. So the main account for the proceeds is reportedly in Qatar, and the U.S. government is controlling it. And also in these files, Peter Attia, Dr. Peter Attia, is very involved in these files. Interesting thing, his parents, Egyptian Christians. The guy is such a loser. From the comments, somebody said, if Satan had a face, it's this guy. His eyes alone are scary. What's happening through all this stuff is heroes become rich men with microphones. Thinkers who diagnose structural harm are labeled negative or radical or ignored. And they said all kinds of things. Deepak Chopra, he said to Epstein, God is a construct. Cute girls are real. And then, of course, the 87-year-old Dalai Lama, also another major liar. when he interacted with a boy, let me see, I don't remember what that year that was. April 2023, he suggested the child should suck his tongue, and it was laughed off. People have got to stop laughing when this happens. Please stop laughing. None of this is funny. So anyway, so the Dalai Lama, another fake religious man, right? And I read that he received an annual subsidy of $180,000 a year from the CIA. Your tax dollars hard at work. Like I said all along, we are paying them to murder the rest of us. So I dug up what this $180,000 was about, and actually, he didn't just get $180,000 himself. It was budget items, including subsidies to the Dalai Lama for $180,000. And that came out of the State Department. And I found two sources, so it is in fact true. Los Angeles Times, 1998, subsidy to the Dalai Lama, $180,000. But the Dalai Lama is a Dalai liar. Dalai Lama, his big claim is that he spent 3 years living as a monk in an Indian ashram after a transformative encounter with a monk during university. But that origin story of the Dalai Lama was challenged by a 2024 Guardian investigation, which reported inconsistencies in his timeline and pointed to evidence that much of the 2010-2013 period was apparently actually spent at the UK based Manor a temple where he was making promotional videos. In that framing, his India monk phase looked less like sustained monastic immersion and more like a series of visits. So, yeah, so Dalai Lama, not such a good person, right? Let me see. And another Muslim trick. I certainly hope Muslim people don't surround themselves and decide to hate me like nobody else's business. Keep in mind, I am simply the messenger. I was not involved. I did not cook up any of this stuff. I am merely trying to tell you that everybody has been tricked. And today is my day to talk about Muslim tricks in particular. So over there, everybody's heard about the black stone, right? It's known as the Hadad Baba in Arabic, is an object of reverence in Islam. In the eastern cornerstone of the Kaaba, the ancient building towards which all Muslims pray. And see, I was confused. I thought they prayed toward the Kaaba, but they're actually praying against it. So let me just read what it says. So the Kaaba, Kabah, is the ancient building towards which all Muslims pray. Many Muslims believe that the stone fell from heaven during the time of Adam and Eve, and that it was once pure and dazzling white. But it has turned black because of the sins it has absorbed over the years. But Muslims do not worship the Kaaba or the black stone. They face the direction of the Kaaba when they pray, but it is a place of worship and the one God. So the Kaaba, Kaaba, is a black cube structure in the center of Islam's holiest mosque in Mecca. Now, I only knew kind of the buzzwords, right? So this black box or the Kaaba is in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia controls Mecca and Medina. It manages the Hajj and these other pilgrimages. Saudi Arabia also oversees security and infrastructure. It invests billions in mosque expansion programs. So, by controlling Mecca, the Saudi rulers have religious legitimacy in the Muslim world. They have soft power leverage. They have symbolic authority. The Saudi king carries the title custodian of the two holy mosques. This ties political authority to sacred geography. So online, people say the Kaaba is mischaracterized and they claim it's a mysterious black cube worship object. Or they claim online that Kaaba is a pagan relic and a cult symbol. So, actually, it is all those things, but here we are in a twisted world, right? Up is right, down is down, right? So if the Saudis control Mecca, it could be possible the whole thing is made up, right? I mean, they wrote the history, right? His story. I didn't write the history. I haven't even looked at their history book. So, but if you're a Saudi and you control Mecca or a gypsy, as I would call them, you then have influence over 1.9 billion Muslims globally. Quite a big group, huh? You also have annual management over millions of pilgrims because they all take these pilgrimages to that black box. And you would also receive financial and diplomatic leverage. Huh. Funny how these things work, right? So, this religious infrastructure is part of Saudi Arabia's broader legitimacy structure. So, Saudi Arabia controls Islam's holiest site, and Saudi power is often politically controversial. So, the Kaaba becomes a symbolic focal point in broader geopolitical conspiracy narratives. So, they claim that mainstream people do not support the Saturn theory. I support the Saturn theory. They worship Saturn because Saturn is code for Satan. So they will tell you that no, these historians don't do this. Yes, of course they don't do that because they'd lose their historian jobs the minute they stepped out of line, right? I started talking about this whole thing publicly early 2020, and I got nothing but grief, okay? And all these years, oh, you people talking about them eating babies and all this stuff, you're all a bunch of crazy losers. Well, actually, come to find out, the latest release of the Epstein files proves all of us right. So, for those of you that doubted, now's your time to apologize yourself and take a deeper look for yourself. No one was lying to you on purpose. I never lied to you. I showed you all the facts of how I got there. But the inference became Diane is crazy. Do not listen to her. And that is very sad. But it's okay. I took care of it. The minute somebody calls me crazy, I no longer speak to you. So I'm done with you. So that's how I've had to handle it because at some point, you're doing the job of the government. And I find that particularly annoying, okay? It's as if the government isn't after me hard enough and killing me in my own home. Other people who could have supported me, could have at least even listened to me, they actually took the side of the government when they started making those crazy comments. But anyway, let me close off this because I need to take a break here. So, according to them, there is no credible historical or theological evidence that the Kaaba was built for Saturn worship. The claim is based on visual symbolism and cross-cultural geometric parallels, not documentary continuity. Yeah, they didn't say, "Hey, this kebab, it's really a trick." Of course they didn't say that. But to understand how Saudi Arabia came to control Mecca, you have to follow the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Saudi Wahhabi alliance. So this is not ancient inheritance. It was a military conquest in the early 20th century. This was not millions of years ago. So, yes, before the Saudis controlled it, it was the Ottoman. So, for centuries, Mecca was under the Ottoman Empire. And the local rulers, called sheriffs of Mecca, governed the city under Ottoman authority. So, the sheriffs of Mecca were descendants of the Prophet Muhammad's lineage, or the Hashemites. So before Saudi control, Mecca was under Ottoman Hashemite administration. But during World War II, everything changed. The Ottomans sided with Germany. Britain wanted to weaken Ottoman control. So in 1916, The Sharif of Mecca launched the Arab revolt against the Ottomans with British support. After the war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Hussein declared himself king of the Hejaz, which is the region including the Mecca or Saudi Arabia. So at this point, Mecca was ruled by the Hashemite kingdom of Hejaz, not Saudi Arabia. They later became ruled by Saudi Arabia. So all roads seem to keep leading back to the British and cooking all this stuff up, right? Because the British supposedly conquested of Mecca. 1924 to 1924, the Saudi conquest of Mecca. In 1924, Saudi forces attacked the Hejaz. They defeated the Hashemite army, and Mecca fell to them in October of 1924, and Medina fell in 1925. And supposedly the Hashemite rulers fled, but that was the key point. So Britain did not intervene militarily. They chose stability. They eventually recognized the Saudis' control. Saudi control was not ancient destiny, it was consolidation during post Ottoman chaos. That's how they got Mecca, and that's how they got Saudi Arabia. So, and that is an area they can control all these Muslims from, right? Now, you may be sitting there saying, I don't find any of this suspicious. Then that is certainly something to take a look at. If you don't find it suspicious, then maybe you should take a look yourself. Maybe look at some deadlines, some timelines and things. So because they all trace their lineages. For example, Jordan's monarchy traces to the former Sharif of Mecca. So yeah, this Mecca business becomes kind of interesting, right? So so there was no formal treaty assigned Mecca to the Saudis. So what happened was they conquered it and blah blah blah. So but why didn't Britain stop him? So Britain had backed the guy Hussein bin Ali who during the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. But by the 1920s they started to break apart. So Britain did not need to own Mecca. It needed stability in the Arabian Peninsula. It needed protection of Red Sea shipping lanes. It needed friendly rulers near the Persian Gulf. It needed containment of rival European influences. So they recognized Saudi control because it served those interests. So, by controlling Mecca and Medina, the Saudi family gained religious legitimacy across the Muslim world, which makes me very, very suspicious. It gave them authority beyond the tribal Najad. It gave them symbolic power that no other Arabian ruler possessed. It gave them diplomatic leverage. This transformed them from a regional warlord state into a religiously anchored monarchy. See the okay, so it went from a warlord state into a religiously anchored monarchy. You notice how monarchies and religion all start to run together? So, yeah, it became all done by the British. So, was it engineered? Well, not in the secret sense, but Britain allowed the outcome. Britain was in charge. Britain formalized it diplomatically. Britain calculated that Saudi control was preferable to chaos or a weak Hashemite regime. And also because Britain is her cousin, right? So, of course, they gave them control. They were in there to rig the deal for their buddies, right? So, because Saudi Arabia controls Mecca, it controls the quotas, the millions of pilgrims annually. It controls access and infrastructure. It holds soft power influence across Muslim majority countries. Yeah, I would say it gives them a lot of power because Saudi Arabia did not inherit Mecca by ancient right. It captured it militarily during the Ottoman collapse. And Britain recognized the new reality for strategic reasons. Yeah, keep it in the family, right? So, by the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. The Arabian Peninsula was fragmented. Britain's priority was imperial trade security, especially routes to India. So, when the Saud guy conquered the Hejaz in 1924 to 25, Britain did not install Wahhabism, but Britain chose not to stop him. They later recognized his sovereignty under the Treaty of Jeddah in 1927. So yeah, I would say they had their handprints all over it. So so there is some confusion. The perception that Britain gave the Saudis religion arises because British reshaped borders across the Middle East. Britain supported and then abandoned different Arab factions. The British often determined which rulers were recognized internationally. So I think some people say maybe it didn't happen. I think it happened, right? Why were they all over this picture if they weren't controlling things? It doesn't make any sense. So they claim the Saudis did not receive religion from Britain. They had an existing religious political alliance. They conquered Mecca, and Britain accepted the new reality for strategic reasons. I think otherwise, but everybody has to think for themselves. Let's talk a little bit about the Quran and what we're all talking about here. For Muslims, Prophet Muhammad is the most reverend of all men. He is the last and most authoritative in a line of prophets that includes Moses and Jesus, and is believed to have received direct revelations from God through Archangel Gabriel. These revelations form the basis of the Muslim holy text, the Quran. The Quran refers to God as Allah, which is the Arabic word for God. And here again, what do we know about the word God? They came up with the word God, right? Same reason they came up with Saturn, Satan, and all these other words. For all Muslims who have the physical and financial ability to undertake the journey, the 5-day pilgrimage to the great mosque of Mecca and the surrounding area is an obligation to be undertaken once in their lives. Inside the great mosque of Mecca is a black cube shaped structure, the Holy Kaaba. The Kaaba holds a deeply religious significance for Muslims. And that's where the Quran tells the story of Ibrahim, who, when commanded by God, agreed to sacrifice his son Ismail. Scholar Ken Chitwood explains that Muslims believe the Kaaba holds the black stone upon which Ibrahim was to sacrifice Ismail. The pilgrimage ends with Eid al-Adha, the feast of the sacrifice. When pilgrims circle the Kaaba as part of the ritual, many of them try, if possible, to stop and kiss the black stone, emulating the kiss that it received from Muhammad. If they cannot reach it, they are to point to it on each of their 7 circuits around the Kaaba. So they walk around this Kaaba 7 times. And that's many Muslims believe the stone fell from heaven during Adam and Eve. But the black stone is no ordinary rock. Muslims believe that long ago it was sent by God, and that on the day of judgment it will intercede to speak for those who over time sincerely kissed or touched it. So Muslims also believe that on the day of judgment the black stone will develop 2 eyes and a tongue to intercede for the Muslims who kiss or touch the stone with sincerity. Yeah, I don't know about this business with this black stone business, but it is in fact a trick. Whether you care to believe it or not, but everything has been flipped upside down. And I'm going to need to take a break here, so I'll be back on the other side. Okay, I am back. If it sounds like I'm different at times, it's because, well, a few days have passed since my last recording. So let's pick up about this inversion business. Perfect example for you right here. Inversion, when the victims are not redacted, but the perpetrators are. Yeah, so I want to share something with you that, in reference to what I was talking about earlier, that if this had happened to me, like if I was one of these six people they're going to name, yes, I would say very, very much targeted. So let me explain why I'm saying this. There's two people, Rokana and a person called Massey. They're both Congress people. And remember, they're all part of the team, right? I think they just say, well, we need you to go out there and say this today. Because the people they wanted to target were redacted. So they had to make sure they weren't redacted anymore. So let me just read what he said. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Congressman Massey and I went to the Department of Justice to read the unredacted Epstein files. We spent about 2 hours there, and we learned that 70 to 80% of the files are still redacted. Boy, they really got going there, right? In 2 hours, they figured all this stuff out. In fact, there were six wealthy, powerful men that the Department of Justice hid for no apparent reason. When Congressman Massey and I pointed this out to the Department of Justice, hey, you're missing something here. Well, they acknowledged their mistake. And now they have revealed the identity of these six powerful men. See how this is all being set up? It was a secret. It's being hidden. They're powerful men. These men are Salvatore Noguera and Sultan Ahmed bin. The Sultan's in here, right? CEO of Dubai Ports World and billionaire businessman Leslie Wexner. So I'll continue reading. Now, my question is, why did it take Thomas Massey and me going to the Justice Department to get these six men's identities to become public? And if we found six men that were hiding in 2 hours, imagine how many men they are covering up for in those 3 million files. But the story gets worse. The reality is that Donald Trump's FBI scrubbed these files in March. Did you hear me? Donald Trump's FBI scrubbed these files in March, long before Thomas Massey and I passed the Epstein Transparency Act. Now, my bill is clear. The Epstein Transparency Act requires them to redact those FBI files. And yet the Justice Department said to me and to Congressman Massey, we just uploaded whatever the FBI sent us. And guess what? The FBI sent scrubbed files. That means the survivor statements to the FBI naming rich and powerful men who went to Epstein Island, who went to his ranch, who went to his home and raped and abused underage girls or saw underage girls being paraded, they're all hidden. They're all redacted. It's a little bit of a farce. They're inviting all the members of Congress to go to see the Department of Justice unredacted files, but all they've got are redacted files from the FBI. And it's not the fault of the Justice Department attorneys. They were just told to upload things that Donald Trump's FBI had already scrubbed. It's a blatant violation of the Epstein Transparency Act, but it also asks a fundamental question. Who are we protecting? Why are they protecting these rich and powerful men, people I call part of the Epstein class? Why are we in a country where there is no elite accountability for people who do the most heinous things? You have in England the king now calling for investigation and possible prosecution of his own brother. You have in Norway the princess who no longer has support to be the queen. And yet, in the United States of America, we have someone in the cabinet, Howard Lutnick, who is all over these Epstein files, who allegedly had business with Epstein after he was convicted of pedophilia, and he is still in the cabinet. We need to ask ourselves, are we in America going to have elite accountability? Are we going to call on rich and powerful people who broke the law or consorted with a convicted pedophile? Are we going to call them into account? Are we going to have prosecutions for billionaires who went to this island and either raped underage girls or saw underage girls being raped and didn't say anything? Are we going to have investigations? I'll tell you what this is about. It's not just about the 1,200 survivors. It's about two tiers of justice in America. It's about people who can accumulate wealth and power and don't have to care about the rest of America. They have destroyed so much of this country. Income inequality is at a 60-year high. Workers' salaries are less than they have been for 75 years as part of the GDP. Somehow, this country seems to be working for the rich and powerful, but it's not working for ordinary working class Americans. I say enough. It's time to begin with accountability for the Epstein class. Hold them in front of Congress. Those people who visited the island or did business with Epstein after he was a convicted pedophile. Investigate them, prosecute them, and let's return to democratic accountability in the United States of America. Let's return to one system of justice in the United States of America. Let's return to a place where every American has a stake in this country. Wow, quite an impressive little speech, wasn't it? They always have to bring in a brown guy now, don't they? Ro Khanna, brown guy from India, all of his disdain. Yeah, they all make a lot of money once they get into office. Don't kid yourself. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Oh, that Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's such a rebel. She must be like one of us. I thought she was a Republican, but she's talking like a Democrat. Well, wakey, wakey, folks. Marjorie Taylor Greene is retiring from Congress in time to collect her retirement fund. She's retiring after she made her 20 or so $1 million in shady stock deals. None of them are anything but dirty. They're all on that side. And then the question keeps coming up, who was Epstein before Epstein? This goes way back. I will be following that trail, so I hope you're getting ready for it. Yeah, gonna be going on this trail, but I'm gonna be focusing on the boys and the men. I'm not gonna forget the women. That's not what I'm saying. There is a reason why the boys and the men are being left out. There's only a few women in this picture now. Ghislaine Maxwell, Melinda Gates has sufficiently distanced herself. Well, I don't know why Bill was going or hanging around Epstein. I told him that was why we had to get a divorce. She is just as dirty. Do you understand, if I get to it, that the children in the United States can no longer read or comprehend because of Melinda and Bill Gates, their reign of terror on the school system? Yeah, that same Melinda Gates distancing herself from raping children has really robbed them of their minds. And if you really want to know how these people think and talk, look at that Blake Lively case. My God, those people really are vicious, vicious people behind the scenes. So now they're talking about QAnon is back again. Well, QAnon never really left. I put an article down below. I'm not going to be going into it full force today. I never really covered much about QAnon except for what I could verify. I could verify those Podesta brothers have a big, big, huge library of some of the filthiest artwork having to do with children in the world. That I verified. The whole thing with QAnon, it was a blown up deal by a couple of people in the U.S. military, a man named Landry and also Michael Flynn. It was a CIA operation. I have the article down below. But what was before QAnon? Well, before QAnon, we had all that horror in the 80s, right? The Satanic Panic. Well, what was before that? Are you aware that after World War II, the first group of people you've never heard about were the original test victims? And those children were all the children of military people. Yes, you heard that right. The U.S. military had their hands on, I can conservatively rate, between 3 to 5 million children. that they were able to coerce and do all kinds of things to. That was when this all got started. And that will be something I will get back to later. Do you realize the Department of Defense runs the biggest child care center in the entire world? Get those children out of daycare. You can't play both sides of this game. You can't keep them in their hands and you can't play innocent in the end. You got to take a stand. You got to take a stand. If you don't take a stand, you are as guilty as they are. So I will hop off my soapbox right now. When I get to the part about the Department of Defense down the road here, you will see why I am so angry. I was one of those children. So let me carry on here. So, yes, I put the article down below about QAnon. It was all coordinated, just like that whole business about all those aliens. That was also a military operation. It came right out of General LeMay, all the hoaxes about the aliens. So, yes, QAnon is back because of these files, but I would warn you, tread lightly. A lot of it is true, and also tread very, very lightly. A lot of people have not recovered memories. We are literally surrounded by people who were, in fact, abuse systems, so abuse victims themselves. So, I would warn you right now, and I'll say it again soon. Tread lightly when you're dealing with other people. You do not know their trauma history. So let me get back to this part here about this business with Epstein and his buddy from the UAE, running those ports, Mr. Sultan. So, based on publicly released material, Jeffrey Epstein corresponded with Sultan, Sultan of Filth, I call him. Emails include religious discussion, and I will be getting to that right now. Your ears are going to pop off over this deal. Emails included crude language. A photograph of the two men exists near a black and gold textile. Yes, you heard me right. The two of them in these files are standing near a black and gold textile lying on the floor. So, what is that thing lying on the floor? Well, funny you should ask. In these kabas, okay, I was talking about in the last segment, the KAABA, the kaba, they have this black silk cloth that covers it, okay? It is called the Kishwa, Kiswah, and that is a cloth that covers the kaba. Okay, so the Kishwa is the black silk cloth that covers the kaba. It is embroidered with Quranic verses in gold thread. It is replaced annually during the Hajj. It is manufactured in Saudi Arabia under state supervision. So, under state supervision in Saudi Arabia, this black and gold silk piece gets embroidered and it covers the kebab. Okay. So, what happens when they do new ones? Well, the old pieces get archived, they get gifted to dignitaries. They can get mounted in frames. They can get distributed under controlled circumstances. Did you hear me? They can get distributed under controlled circumstances. So Mr. Sultan Man was standing there next to Jeffrey Epstein in a photograph looking at this black piece of cloth on the floor. And it said, newly released files reveal that sacred cloth pieces from the Kaaba in Mecca were shipped by UAE linked contacts to convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein in 2017. The emails detail the shipment of 3 pieces associated with the Kiswa, arranged by Emirati businesswoman Azira Al-Hamadi. So some Emirati businesswoman arranged to ship 3 pieces associated with the Kiswa to um, Epstein. So what is the Kispa? Well, for hundreds of years, and this is the part you're going to flip your head off. Give me a second here. So all I did was I asked the next question. And my next question was this, because I don't know anything about any of this stuff, right? I just learned about the cabal recently. So, so in the last segment, I was talking about the cabal, but I didn't know that there was a kishwa which covered the kebab, right? I thought it just was one black box with some black cloth over it and some gold thread. That's what I thought, right? So, okay, so what it is this. So my next question was this was, well, okay, we knew what the cabal is by now, right? So my next question is, well, what is the kishwa, right? So let me read it to you. For hundreds of years, Egypt Egypt made the black cloth that covers the Kaaba in Mecca. This didn't mean that Egypt owned Mecca. It meant Egypt was powerful and wealthy enough to sponsor it. Making the cloth was a way for rulers to show they were protectors of Islam's holy sites. So now we got Islam in the picture of this black box, which I say is inverted, right? It is not a religious symbol, it is a satanic symbol in the true meaning. So now that we got Egypt out of the way, and I do have a file around here. I'll have to get to it. I did the analysis of all those Egyptian pyramids and stuff. None of that stuff is true, okay? None of it's true. So it's pretty funny that Egypt was the one who started with the cloth, right? So let me get my grip on myself here. So during the Mamluk period, which was the 1200s to the 1500s, Cairo had a special government workshop that made the cloth every year. It was sent to Mecca in a large ceremonial caravan. This procession included soldiers, religious officials, and a decorated statue called the Mamal, which is Mahmal. It was a public display of authority and religious leadership. So why is the main thing from the kebab coming from Egypt is my question, right? So as the story goes, when the Ottoman Empire took control in 1517 from Egypt, they kept the same system. Now, wasn't that just so convenient? So Egypt stayed the production center. Pretty. It's what it says to me is a lot of familiarity, right? You supposedly take control in 1517 and you just keep the same systems, right? And Egypt stayed the production center, but the Ottoman Sultan funded it. The annual caravan from Cairo continued for centuries. It was a political message. The Ottoman ruler was the guardian of the holy city. So now we got the Ottomans are ruling over Mecca and stuff, right? And that so if you're thinking Islam was real before, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know, but it appears to me, just little old me here, that around this 1920 frame, somebody took charge of Mecca that had different intentions, okay? Because let me keep reading here. So this changed in the 1920s when the Saudi rulers took control of Mecca after modern Saudi Arabia was founded in 1932. The cloth began being made inside Saudi Arabia instead of Egypt, and the Egyptian caravan tradition ended. So essentially, Egypt made the Kabah's cloth, what's called the kishim, for several centuries. It was a symbol of political and religious authority. Saudi Arabia made it locally for about the last 100 years. I don't know. That sends off a lot of alarm bells in my mind. You're going to have to think for yourself about this one because to me, it appears highly, highly suspicious. Okay. So how did I even get going here today? Well, I've talked a lot about the Ashkenazis. I've talked a lot about their known incest issues and the disabilities that they're showing now. I've talked a lot about how the Ashkenazis are raising the alarms. I also spent a couple of years over on Facebook, obviously not every single day, but I got into several groups that had to do with IVF and all this kind of business, right? So I've had a pretty active interest in this IVF business for a long time. So I was just tooling along, and this is what got me started on this whole deal with the incest and all of that. And here is where I got started. I'm going to read from this piece I found. In 2021, the Saudi Society of Medical Genetics organized a symposium where it highlighted that consanguineous marriages are one of the reasons for the high incidence of genetic diseases in Saudi Arabia. And at that point, I did a head whip because I was thinking, what do you mean genetic disease in Saudi Arabia? This is sounding like the Ashkenazis, right? So I'll keep reading. It emphasized the necessity of raising health awarenesses among those planning to marry to address this reality. And I kept thinking, wait a minute, this is sounding exactly like those Ashkenazis. So, especially regarding conditions such as sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, intellectual disabilities, metabolic disorders, and others. Another study revealed that there is a congenital deformity in one of every 24 births in Saudi Arabia, where the global rate is 1 in every 33. So the global rate is 1 in 33, but in Saudi Arabia, in 2021, it's popping up as 1 in 24. And this, I'll keep reading here. This is because consanguineous marriages allow negative and recessive genetic traits to express themselves more easily. For example, if the husband has sickle cell anemia and his cousin carries the gene, half of their children will have the disease, and the other half will be carriers. If both parents are carriers without having the disease, half of the children will be carriers. A quarter will have the disease, and a quarter will be unaffected. Sickle cell anemia is a condition that can lead to serious complications. In Saudi Arabia, 4.2% of the population carries the sickle cell trait, and this percentage reaches 17% in the eastern province. So yeah, so I read that and I thought, wait a minute. This is sounding exactly like these people are already in trouble. They're already in trouble and they're only like 2 generations in, right? So then I went looking further. Saudi healthcare is strategically, and what you'll find is this, is that when they start making these new plans and stuff and these, oh, this effort 2020 or this effort 2030, they always leave extensive paperwork online. Anybody can find this paperwork. You just have to have the diligence to want to sit down and read the paperwork. Welcome to my world. I live for these kinds of reports, okay? This is the existence for me. So, yeah, this IVF stuff comes packed with all kinds of new information that I didn't know about before. So, they say the fertility and IVF market in the kingdom is forecast to grow strongly through 2031. So, why is this big demand for IVF? Well, they say it's driven by social demand, advanced technologies like AI assisted embryo assessment, and greater clinical capacity, which creates demand for highly trained specialists in reproductive endocrinology and IVF procedures. So yeah, so if some of these things I'm reading sound like I'm reading from a medical brochure, it's because I am reading from a medical brochure. So, like I said, if you want to go looking, there's lots to look at. So, okay, so additionally, a recent fertility and gynecological conference in Jeddah, JEDDAH, highlighted AI stem cell research and advanced reproductive care, indicating investment in future focused reproductive medicine research and practice. Yeah. You read the word investment, you got all the paperwork you want to read through because then they pump out endless amounts of business plans and stuff. So what is this about? Well, high rates of first cousin and parallel cousin marriage are well documented in parts of the Gulf. The consequences are not speculative, and everything I'm talking about will be over on my website. So, for example, elevated autosomal recessive disorders, higher incidence of rare genetic diseases, increased burden on neonatal ICUs, pediatric care, and lifelong treatment, long care drag on workforce health and productivity. So, Saudi clinicians and planners have been publishing this for decades. So, they have been publicly saying, hey, we're noticing this stuff is on the horizon, okay? And then these people are writing it into business reports, which you and I can access and figure this stuff out from. Pretty easy, huh? You just got to have the will to dig through all the paperwork. So, okay, so instead of confronting marriage practices directly, which might trigger religious and tribal resistance, the kingdom has taken technocratic steps. What they're doing now, and remember, they're only 2 generations in, supposedly. This should not be going on. The alarm bells should be screeching in everybody's ears. So they're already taking these steps, which are huge in the world, okay? Mandatory premarital genetic screening, expansion of IVF and reproductive genetics, investment in genomics programs like a national genome initiatives, quiet recruitment of top tier foreign specialists in reproductive endocrinology, clinical genetics, embryology, AI assisted embryo selections, and they're offering citizenship or permanent status to elite medical scientific talent that fit these models. Yeah, they're really in there. They're sounding the alarms really big. So they say that if this were just about staffing hospitals, work visas would suffice. Citizenship or quasi citizenship signals something deeper. Yes, they don't just hand out those citizenships to just anybody. This is a huge, huge deal. So, what they're doing is they're coming up with long term institutional memory, meaning these experts will stay in that region for decades. They're trying to gain trust with royal hospitals and national registries. They're gaining control over sensitive genetic data. They're continuing across generations of policy. And this aligns with Saudi Vision 2030, which was to build internal capacity so the state is not perpetually dependent on rotating foreign contractors. So, yes, this whole thing aligns exactly with this Saudi 2030 thing, all this IVF business does. So, um, this is how states prepare without saying, we have a problem. No Gulf ruler is going to say publicly, our kinship system is creating a genetic crisis. Instead, Saudi Arabia is importing expertise, normalizing advanced reproduction intervention. And this is the big key because this is advanced reproduction intervention. This is not just the beginning of it for these people, right? And they're framing it as innovative, excellence, and future readiness. And they say they want to let families choose technical solutions, IVF plus screening, rather than banning marriages. So, even from a government perspective, this is risk management. So, somehow they seem to be thinking in multi generational timelines. They expect genetic load to increase if nothing is done. They're betting that biomedical technology can offset social inertia. They want that technology inside the kingdom under state control. This is consistent with how centralized states behave when they see trouble coming and cannot say it directly. So let's talk about what they're basically doing now is they're trying to engineer around future problems. Genetics don't care about religion or ethnicity. The lesson from the Ashkenazi genetics, it is about what happens when a population experiences centuries of endogamy or founder effects. And let me give you a couple of definitions here. Endogamy, Endogamy, is a cultural practice of only marrying within a specific social group, religious denomination, caste, or ethnic group, rejecting any from outside of the group or belief structure as unsuitable for marriage or other close personal relationships. Its opposite is exogamy, which describes the social norm of marriage outside the group, which includes small initial populations, repeated intra-group marriage, limited genetic inflow. Certain recessive mutations become statistically concentrated. So, yeah, the Ashkenazi populations are simply one of the most extensively studied cases. So, of all of the cases of this that has been studied, it's been the Ashkenazis, okay? Because they live in countries with advanced medical research. They created early carrier screening programs. They publish openly. So that makes the Ashkenazis a case study because they have been out there screaming and yelling, hey, 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 we got to start watching these marriages. Hey, 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 defects are showing up. So I can conclude, just my conclusion, that these Gulf people had to know about all this Ashkenazi, even if you don't believe that they connect personally and physically through their own relationships like I do. They do, in fact, connect. So, Gulf ministries already know that their own numbers have high rates of first cousin marriage. They know that parallel cousin preferences in some tribes. They know that recurrent rare disorders are appearing in clusters. They already know that rising lifetime healthcare costs are on the way. Saudi Arabia did not need to hear alarm bells from another population. Their neonatal wards and genetic registries already began ringing them loudly. So, what they likely learned from the Ashkenazi medicine, if anything, the Saudi planners would absorb its mythology and ethnic. Carrier screening works. Premarital testing reduces disease incident without banning marriage. IVF and PGT can dramatically lower recessive disease transmission, and cultural change is slow. Technical mitigation is faster. And that's exactly the same path that Saudi Arabia appears to be taking because they're going with, and remember, I can't say this enough, they're only a couple generations in. They're already talking about mandatory premarital genetic screening, expansion of IVF and reproductive genetics, recruitment of elite fertility experts, framing everything as health optimization, not social correction. And it all lines up to that Saudi Vision 2030. So, Saudi Arabia is reacting to isn't reacting to who Ashkenazi Jews are. They're reacting to what population genetic teaches when marriage patterns stay closed for generations. So, let's talk a little bit about IVF. And people are very casual with this. Oh, yeah. There was a big movement years ago that insurances were paying for women to just stay in the workforce. You can just save those eggs for later. It is absolutely not true. I can't think of a more brutal, and I'm talking brutal process than extracting those IVF eggs. The cost and the burden to the women is off the charts. They use ovarian stimulation that require weeks of hormone injections. Egg retrieval is invasive, painful, and not risk-free. Their risk of ovarian hyperstimulation, clotting, long-time endocrine stress. IVF infrastructure is expensive, specialized, and slow to build. It creates ethical religious and social complications that have to also be managed. So they're pushing this IVF for this very same reason, right? Because, well, they're seeing that they're not going to have natural reproduction, is what the whole bottom line is. So, likely they're seeing these rising incidents of rare recessive disorders, and they're seeing multi-generational family clusters. So yeah, they're starting to see all this likely at the early hospital level. And remember, I believe they're connected to the Ashkenazi Jews. So hey, just ask your relatives, right? You saw what they did. So um, here's a little bit about IVF. Men's role in IVF is minimal. Women absorb the pain, the hormones, the medical risk, and the social pressure to fix the outcomes. So yeah, they didn't just get interested in IVF. They had to have this has to be their last resort, right? Because to get somebody to stick through that IVF process is pretty tricky. Um, so I'm going to put this on hold for a second here. And from what I found, IVF carries several layers. There's a lot of secrecy in that. People will, like I said, I was in several groups over on Facebook for an extended period of time. I got the idea that most of the people, not all of them, but most of the people appeared to be lying about something, right? They were talking about they needed these eggs so that they could have a family of their own, right? But what I found was a lot of them were probably talking in code, right? Because they maybe needed those eggs to give to a surrogate to then produce a baby for them to have. And also, there was an extremely, I would say, off the wall religious element to all this IVF business. In the United States, they claim they're storing about 1 million of these embryos all around this country. And my observation is this: I never ran across more kooky, questionable people in all of my work than these IVF people. And they all have this religious tint. It's like, well, these eggs are there. That's God's will. We gotta implant them in people. Yeah, and this crazy business. And here's the catcher on all that. How do they go around Facebook giving away their eggs to other people? Well, because it was written into the legal system. So how it works is this: is that the um, embryos are classified as property. That's the trick. So it's easy to transfer a piece of property than it is a person, right? So they kept the classification of embryos as property. So that way you don't have to even have an attorney involved. I can say, hey, I got some extra embryos. I'm looking for people to give them to. And then people line up and tell me what good Christians they are and how they should get the embryos and blah, blah, blah. And then we can make this decision that, okay, well, I'll go ahead and just ship you some of my embryos and we're going to be like a family now. Yeah, they create these, I would call them questionable dynamics, right? And like I said, all of the people that seem to be storing all these embryos were run by religious groups. And yeah, and then classifying embryos as property to sneak it through the system. So yeah, so there's a lot of sneakiness in this stuff. And I would have to say, and I stopped following those groups a couple, 3 years ago, but I would have to say that I found the people posting in those groups were much smarter than the doctors and people that were coming up with this IVF business. Here's what I found: the people themselves, in order for this to work, for the people who sincerely wanted to get a baby, they had to understand more about this IVF business than their doctor did, because all I saw, and this went on for a few years, was people gathering together to interpret things, and the doctors didn't seem to know. So I would say I am personally 100% against any IVF or surrogacy. I'll put that out on the table. But anyway, so yeah, it is not what anybody is thinking it is. So yeah, there's a lot of sneaking around. A lot of times surrogates could really be being used. The woman could act like, oh, I'm getting IVF, and she run around wearing a fake baby bump for a few months. Yeah, there's a lot of pretty sneaky things that go along with this IVF business. At least that was my impression, right? There is a big business in selling those fake baby bumps, so just keep that in mind. So, anyhow, so let's look at some of where this bottlenecks came from. Because when you look at genetics, if you read the word bottleneck, that was where I first got going on this years ago. Bottleneck, to me, like a non-historian, means incest. Okay, to them it means some other convoluted stuff. But when you read bottleneck in genetics, you mean you're looking at incest, is what you're looking at. So Charles II of Spain and the Spanish House of Habsburg was what I would call the bottleneck, okay? The Spanish Habsburg line is a traditional example of concentrated endogamy. Many uncle, niece, cousin marriages across generations. They had severe health problems, infertility, and ultimately a dynastic collapse. Political fallout, the War of the Spanish Succession after the line ended. So also, there was a House of Bourbon, and they had cousin marriages for alliance locking. And Bourbons did extensive intra elite marriages also, but with somewhat wider European intramarriage, often reducing the extreme bottleneck that we see in Spain. And then there's Queen Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia. This illustrates a different mechanism. A mutation can spread widely through elite intermarriage even without extreme inbreeding. So hemophilia appeared in Victoria's descendants and moved into multiple royal houses via marriage. And then, of course, the famous Habsburg jaw, a famous example of a heritable trait that became a dynasty marker, likely reinforced by repeated close kin marriage. So then I took a look at the comparison to Saudi style IVF policy. So, European royals, their solution was control marriages politically, hide consequences socially, triage succession legally. And the modern Gulf tech group, they want to preserve the marriage norms. They want to reduce consequences medically through screening, IVF, and embryo selection. They want to lock in expertise institutionally by recruiting people. So yeah, they're following, I would say, a million parallels. Okay, um, in both systems, the burden always falls on the women. The queen gets blamed for infertility, miscarriages, pressure to produce heirs, dangerous childbirth expectations. And the hidden lie possibly in all of this, I'm not really convinced that the royals have been having their own children for all this time. I'm just not that convinced of it. Maybe their surrogate pools were the ones coming up with all the problem children. You got to question this stuff, right? Because when you're looking back at the Habsburgs, all you've got are sketches, right? So you're putting a lot of faith into those sketches, and I think we should always question all of this stuff. So, did the Habsburg chin get that bad when it did? Likely not, because the Habsburgs became the Windsors, and they don't seem to have any chin problems. But like I said, there's a lot of lying going on here. They probably haven't been having their own children for centuries, so this could be a lot of a really good cover story, right? So, they say that historians, genealogists, and court culture analysts argue that royal reproduction has not always been biologically straightforward. No, of course not. Extreme secrecy around royal pregnancies and births. I mean, Meghan Markle had a baby bump that there's pictures of it actually fell away from her body and had to be grabbed, okay? This is not just like, oh yeah, I'm making this up. I don't think they're having. Yeah, of course they have been seen with fake baby bumps. Okay, um, I think there's a very small amount of family resemblances in these groups. Take a look for yourself. I love looking at pictures. These people do not look anything like each other, and that's what happens when you don't really pay attention and you have to use a bunch of surrogates, right? So I could really argue both sides of this coin. So I personally wouldn't lock myself into any of this stuff other than to say they're inbreeding and that inbreeding causes deflects. So how they justify all this and write it all up, well, that's another story. But I will tell you what they said. So looking at the modern House of Windsors, some critics, myself included, the wide variation in facial structure, stature, coloring, and build across the close relatives. And they claim the absence of strong reoccurring dynastic markers. And they say a sharp visual break from early lines and later They have all these reasons why. And they say the use of surrogacy, historically implausible until very recently. Well, I don't really know about that. Who says that, right? And they claim that non-paternity events, mistresses and court aides, yeah, those people are all in the picture too, right? And they manage succession. I think they've come up with some sort of magic trick. Oh, speaking of that, I'm glad I brought that up. Let me put this on hold and I'll come back and talk to you about magic for a second. Yeah, I wandered off earlier when I was talking about the kishwa, the cloth on the Kaaba. Well, that cloth, I wandered around a lot of Middle Eastern or Gulf channels on social media talking about there were several of them talking about Epstein and this cloth, okay? And one speculation that made the most sense to me was that why would Epstein want to even have that cloth? Well, that cloth, remember, we're talking about inversion, right? That cloth to them could also be used for black magic events. So that was the only thing I really found about that cloth that kind of rung a bell with me was that why would Epstein then want that cloth? Well, because first of all, it is in fact a satanic thing. I mean, you can still think it's that cube and everybody should pray around all that kind of stuff. I don't personally think that, and that's okay. But in my mind, it is just a psyops, right? They took what may have been a a religious thing and turned it into a satanic thing, or was it satanic from the beginning? I don't really know about that. I wasn't around in the 1900s, so um, yeah. So anyhow, yeah. So I don't think we're going to know if these royal people are having their own children or they're not. I happen to notice faces. I think there's a problem. I don't think any of them look like they came together. None of them act like they came together. They all seem to hate each other. Maybe that accounts for some of it. So, um, and they've been managing their marriages through, cousin marriages all this time. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about. I have done extensive shows about these Ashkenazi Jews. You can look for them. I know I've done couple, three, four shows. All you have to do is find Ashkenazi in the title. And I have technically traced them through their entire little journey from Spain and Germany and blah, 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 blah. But what I'm going to give you now is just an overview, okay? The Ashkenazi group traces its origins to early medieval Germany, originating from the Jewish communities who lived in the 10th century in the Rhineland Valley and in neighboring France before gradually migrating eastward following the Crusades. Facing persecution in Western Europe, particularly following the Black Death in the 14th century, the bulk of the Ashkenazi Jews then migrated to the Kingdom of Poland at the encouragement of Casimir III the Great and his successors, making Poland the main center of Ashkenazi Jewish until the Holocaust. And that also brings an interesting thing about Poland into the picture, right? I'll keep reading. Ashkenazium adapted their traditions to Europe and underwent a transformation in their interpretation of Judaism. They traditionally follow the German Rite synagogue ritual and until the Holocaust primarily spoke Yiddish, an offshoot of Middle High German written in a variety of the Hebrew script, with significant Hebrew, Aramaic, and Slavic influence. Starting from the 19th century, millions of Ashkenazi Jews immigrated to the United States which now houses the largest Ashkenazi community in the world. If you're ever wondering why this country is so loaded with psychopaths, I have just answered your question. Throughout the centuries, Ashkenazim made significant contributions to Western philosophy, scholarship, literature, art, music, and science. Of the estimated 8.8 million Jews living in Europe at the beginning of World War II, the majority of them were Ashkenazi, about 6 million. More than two-thirds were systematically murdered in the Holocaust. These included 3 million of the 3.3 million Polish Jews, which accounted for 91%. Well, or it could have been they were just killing off a lot of their relatives they wanted to wipe out of the way, right? Well, we're going to start a new plan after World War II. So, those people in Poland over there that, that we're related to, how about if we stage this event in World War II? We're going to round those people up and put them in camps and kill them, right? Hey, who cares if they're our relatives? It's time for them to go. We gotta build this thing up after World War II. We got people to take down and things to do. Yeah, probably exactly how it happened. So why do you think these thugs are still hanging around Poland, right? So let me retrace here. So 3 million of the 3.3 million Polish Jews, or 91%, or 900,000 of the 1.5 million in Ukraine, 60%, and 50, well, I'm reading this all wrong. Anyways, 91% of them were Jewish, Polish Jews, right? Brings the Polish people into a very interesting part here, right? So, other Slavic nations like Germany, Hungary, and the Baltic states, and over 25% of the Jews in France. Sephardi Jewish communities suffered similar decimation in a few countries, including Greece and the Netherlands and the former Yugoslavia. Yeah, those were the kill boxes for those people, right? A large majority of the victims were Ashkenazi Jews. So their percentage dropped from an estimate of 92% of world Jewry in 1930 to nearly 80% of world Jews today. So yeah. So the vast majority spoke Yiddish. Many of the surviving Ashkenazi Jews immigrated to countries such as Israel, Canada, Argentina, Australia, UK, and the United States after the war. Following the Holocaust, some sources place Ashkenazim today as making up approximately 83 to 85% of Jews worldwide. So one other person said, yeah, about 74%. But yeah, it's a high estimate, okay? So, and here's where it gets interesting. They're going to give themselves away by all their prizes, right? They love those prizes, those medals they didn't really earn, and all that kind of stuff. So the Ashkenazi, and remember, I talked also about that book that I read. The guy's name was Gus Russo, Russo. He wrote a couple of books. The one you're looking for is the one called Super Mob. And that was exactly how the Ashkenazi Jews all ended up in Chicago with the mafia. And prohibition is what set them all loose, but I can't go backwards today. So anyway, so let me get back up here and focus. So um, the Holocaust also put an end to the development of the Yiddish language. The vast majority of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, around 5 million, were Yiddish speakers. So, yeah, though Ashkenazi Jews never exceeded 3% of the American population, Jews account for 37% of the winners. Oh, uh, whenever I look at those royal family members and all these people wearing all those medals, I literally, I just burst out laughing because they are such posers, such predators, and such parasites. Anyway, so yeah, they make up 3% of the American population. but they account for 37% of the winners of the U.S. National Medals of Science. Yeah, the people all trying to kill us. 25% of the American Nobel Peace Prize winners in literature, and 40% of American Nobel Peace Prize in science and economics. Yeah, they're trying to kill us and rob us, right? So, anyway, so the research shows that the origins of the matriarchal line for the Ashkenazi Jews comes from Europe, and that was the whole thing they lied about for all this time. And I've already talked about all that. And then it morphed into the interesting thing is I found a discussion group that was talking about this. How could it be that the Ashkenazi Jews are just one genetic group? Well, because they're one gypsy group, right? The answer is a relative simple one. They didn't reproduce at a noticeable level with others outside their group, not even with other Jewish people. See, here you got the information, right? Researchers have shown Ashkenazi Jews were a reproductively isolated population in Europe for about 1,000 years, or so they say. And then somebody else asked the question, so why is it that the wealthiest, most powerful abusers on earth are all Ashkenazi Jews? This historical account is undisputed. The Khazar people converted to the Jewish faith known as Judaism, thus becoming known as Jews themselves. However, adopting a religion does not change your race. A Caucasian Christian who converts to Islam does not become Arabic. Therefore, the Khazars are Jews by conversion. They are not the descendants of the ancient Israelite tribe of Judah. They are converts to the religion known as Judaism. It is hotly contested, but evidence suggests Ashkenazi Jews are the descendants of the Khazars who migrated into Europe under a new name, Jews. Science explains that Ashkenazi Jews are the most genetically analyzed group of people in the entire world. This is due to their tight knit family tree. Ashkenazis are close as fourth or fifth cousins, and everyone is a 30th cousin. Yet their origin, instead of being primarily the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, present day Jewish populations, are primarily the children of a Turkish people who lived in what is now Russia, north of Georgia, east of Ukraine. Another study attempts to identify the origins of the name Ashkenazi along with the Yiddish language. Researchers discovered there were 4 ancient villages named Isagnaz, Eskiknaz, Ashkenaz, and Ashakur in northeastern Turkey. These names are also found in this part of the world and may be derived from the word Ashkenaz. As for the Yiddish language, few people can speak or understand it outside of Ashkenazi Jews. The study suggests the Yiddish language originated in this part of the world 1,000 years ago. Yiddish was a secret language of the Jewish merchants who used it to control their monopoly on trade from Asia to Europe along the Silk Road. Ha! Interestingly enough, we find the word Ashkenazi in the Bible in Genesis 10:1-3. We're told Ashkenaz was a great great grandson of Noah through his son Japheth. That's Japheth. Now, if Ashkenaz is the ancestor of Ashkenazi Jews, then they're not Semitic people as they claim. Why? Well, you can only claim to be Semitic if you can trace your ancestry through Noah's son Shem, not Jabston. Therefore, it was Shem's descendants that became known as Hebrews and later Israelites. Yet another study that seeks to identify the origins of Ashkenazi Jews found another potential source, Europe itself. In fact, more than 80% of Ashkenazi DNA has European ancestry on the maternal side. The study contradicts the notion that European Jews mostly descend from people who left Israel and the Middle East around 2,000 years ago. Instead, a substantial portion of the population originates from local Europeans who converted to Judaism. The study goes on to say the material line of Ashkenazi Jews has been based in Europe for the last 3,500 years, long before biblical Israelites were exiled from the land of ancient Israel. This indicates Ashkenazi Jews are not the descendants of biblical Israelites. Further, the study indicated these geological roots were more likely due to the conversion of European women. Additionally, the same study cited previous studies that suggest some paternal origins of Ashkenazi Jews came from the Near East, which includes the land of Israel. However, on the paternal Ashkenazi Levite side, DNA shows more than 50% European origin, which suggests a possible Khazar source. These scientific studies, along with historical records of the Khazarian conversion to Judaism, firmly conclude Ashkenazi Jews are not the descendants of ancient Israelites. This reality invalidates the Rhineland hypotheses and indicates Ashkenazi Jews are a mix of various people who adopted Judaism throughout history. The Bible also confirms this, as Ashkenazi Jews do not meet the biblical requirements to claim God's everlasting covenant to Abraham. Ashkenazi Jews are not many nations, many people, nor do they bless the nations of the world, nor possess the gates of their enemies. Moreover, most Jews are atheists. This is the part that I find fascinating. Most Jews are atheists, few are religious, and most importantly, even less have accepted Jesus Christ. For generations, Christians have shown their admiration and support for Jews, thinking they are God's chosen people. This has led to an outpouring of support for Israel from a Christian community and the United States. History should be corrected, and Christians should understand who they are supporting and reflect on why. Yeah, that whole thing about atheists is really fascinating to me, and I found actually some articles from their own lips. When we think of Israel, we think of the Holy Land, biblical history, and the streets where Jesus once roamed. Today, the land is inhabited by those of the Jewish faith, or at least that is a common belief. However, as reported by Harris' 2015 Gallup poll, it was revealed Israel is not as religious as we are led to believe. Imagine that. In fact, 65% of Israelis are either not religious or atheist. This makes Israel one of the least religious nations in the entire world. It was startling to discover Israel is less religious than communist China, where 61% of the population say they are atheists. As a whole, religion continues to decline around the globe, but Jews are found to be the least religious of all. And I found that very, very fascinating. But also remember, I mean, it's just an outpost over there from the United States. The whole Israel Jew thing, anyway, they needed a way to embed themselves with their friends from the Gulf states to take on the rest of the Middle East. Is as simple as I see it. But I need to take a break here, so I'll be back on the other side. Okay, I am back. Well, I was taking a break earlier. I put a link to that Gus Russo book about Supermob. It is an excellent, excellent place to start if you want to learn how these people, the Ashkenazis, ended up in Chicago. Just a couple of latest news things. They're talking about President Trump is talking about releasing information about UFOs. Well, Curtis LeMay, the General Curtis LeMay, the big liar who bombed Japan and murdered so many people, America's psychopath. Curtis Emerson LeMay, no relationship. He actually is the one at the head of all of this UFO business. So if you go over to my website and click on the elite criminal files, you'll see I did a whole file just for General LeMay himself about all this fake UFO stuff. So don't take the bait. It isn't true. So let's clear up one thing about Trump. The name Drumpf, 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 was changed to Trump in the early 20th century. The reason was not only the desire to adapt to the English speaking environment, but also the desire to distance himself from his German ancestry. In the mid 20th century, after World War II, German roots could be socially undesirable in the United States. Yeah, they pretty much rewired this whole country to hide those German roots now, didn't they? So, first, Drumpf, the Drumpf, was changed to Trumpf, Trumpf, and then shortened to Trump. And there's a little bit of a lie about his Scandinavian ancestry. In the 1970s, when Fred Trump, who was the father, was actively doing business, the family claimed to be of Scandinavian descent to improve relations with Jewish tenants and business partners who might have negative associations with German roots after World War II. So, yeah, so he said that they were Scandinavian, but that actually wasn't true. Fred Trump explained his unusual accent by the fact that he also has a Jewish roots. I would say gypsy myself, but anyway, so Donald Trump, Trump, has also repeated this version of his Scandinavian ancestry in his public speeches, although historians later confirmed his German roots. So Trump comes from Germany. In his book, The Art of the Deal, Trump said that his father was born in Germany, although this is not true. His father, Fred Trump, was born on October the 11th, 1905 in the Bronx. His grandfather, Frederick Trump, arrived in the United States from Bavaria at the age of 16. So, yeah, the grandfather or the father of his father was born in Germany. Funny how they always get these things so twisted around, right? People are all going crazy. What's going on with my electricity bill? Well, welcome to the State of the Union and escalating fees and all of that these people love so much. First of all, electricity is the worst thing you should be doing right now for your health. So don't complain, cut it down. And if you got lulled into using it last month, wise up this month. Things are not going to get any better. They're just going to get worse. So learn to adapt, bundle up. Everybody I saw complaining about their electricity bills, well, obviously they had very valid complaints. I am not minimizing that. But most people are not aware that your electricity is poison to your system. Invest all you want in vitamins and longevity stuff, but as long as you're running that electricity, you are damaging your own DNA. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about Prince Andrew, or whatever his name is now. He was recently arrested. Funny thing, he was arrested on his 66th birthday. The time of the arrest, they arrested a man in his 60s in Norfolk at about 8 a.m. So we got two of their favorite things in there, 66 and 8 a.m. Is this the diffusion? Yeah, of course it is. They're going to probably eventually say, well, I'm going to step aside because I'm dying of cancer and I'm going to let these lovely people, Catherine and William, take over. Well, what do people know about Catherine and William? Nothing. They say, well, we're monarchists, but we really support Catherine. What do you know about these people? What do you know about these people? Nothing, I would propose. So, yes, hopping from one fire to the next, right? Clinging to those royals. So yeah, time of the arrest, and who else has ended up in the UAE? Well, Juan Carlos I has been living in Abu Dhabi in the UAE since August of 2020. He abdicated in 2014 in favor of his son Philippe VI. Yeah, that's probably what's going to happen now. They'll get um, King Charles aside, for the lovely couple, William and Catherine, who are probably really horrendous people. I mean, I gotta say, they're all horrendous people. Why do you think they're any different? So, yeah, so they'll probably get shuffled off to the UAE back to their gypsy cousins, right? So, I'm not saying that they have a better system or we have a worse system. We actually have a clown who wears orange makeup and is right now wearing diapers, sitting in charge of the whole thing in the White House. So, yeah, I'm not going after other countries. They all connect together. Another little interesting thing, Epstein updated his will 2 days before his death by suicide in 2019. I'm glad those attorneys were on this stuff. So he updated his will. I think Epstein, well, I'm sure he's alive, but I think that he is either directly under City of London or the BIS, the Vatican group. That's who he reports to. So let me update about this thing that they released all these people's names. They released 6 names, and that's where they got the UAE guy's name in it, okay? So the story continues. So they said they got 6 names, and Sultan was one of the people in those names, right? Sultan and Lex Wexner. Well, everybody knows Lex Wexner's name, right, by now? Very few people knew the Sultan's name. So yeah, I would think it was a complete setup because they claimed they had 6 in the group, then they walked back 4 of them. So that only leaves Lex Wexner and the UAE guy out there exposed. And they're also claiming now that maybe only 3% of the files have been released. So yeah, who knows, right? But the Sultan, I have him down here in a bit. Yeah, okay, let me get to that in a second. Um, are you aware of this? I found this just I don't shock that easily, but journalists they can embed in war zones, foreign conflict areas, and international detention sites. But where can they not just go in and look around? Well, funny you should ask that question. Journalists cannot demand entry into a state prison in the United States. Just let that sink in. There's a fabulous, I'm talking fantastic movie that came out, and I'd like to use it as an encouragement to you. There was a group of prisoners in Alabama, and luckily, I'm just going to go very light on it because of time and all that. But these prisoners are a complete inspiration to me, and they should be to all of us. These prisoners locked into a dark prison in Alabama figured out a way to communicate. Sure, it was with not stolen, but illegal cell phones that they snuck into the prison. Well, the prison guards bring in the cell phones and sell them to the inmates. So these prisoners wanted to get their word out, and they figured out a way to worm their way out of that system. And they got these journalists to work with them, and they exposed the whole rot within that system. But of course, the one guy in charge of the rot said, "There is nothing wrong here." So yeah, I'll be getting back to that in a second. But anyway, so yeah, journalists cannot demand entry into a state prison. That tells you all that you might want to know for the future. I have a show prepared that I'll hope to get to. The U.S. has a long, and I mean very, very disturbing rate of locking people up. You're going to have to be deciding, are you going to let them take you alive or are you going to let them take you down? I don't know. Letting them take you alive could be a real big risk, but hey, decisions, right? Got a lot of decisions to make. So, anyhow, so here's what happened. A DOJ spokesperson and reporting from The Guardian have clarified that 4 of the 6 named individuals did not appear to have any known connection to Epstein or Maxwell, and instead were included in the files because they were part of a law enforcement photo lineup unrelated to the investigation. In response to this classification, Rokana, the Indian guy who's also an attorney, has acknowledged this explanation and walked back the implication for those 4 names, while still criticizing how the situation was handled and blaming the Justice Department for confusion. Are we all stupid? Has everybody been taking crazy pills with their coffee in the morning? Rokana is an attorney. He got his BA from the University of Chicago. He got his attorney degree from Yale Law School. Everyone knows the name of Lex Wexner from Victoria's Secret, but who knew the Sultan's name or face? Wexner retained Jeffrey Epstein as his financial manager from 1987 to 2007 and was initially the main client of Epstein's money management firm, according to Bloomberg. Epstein ran his business from a house Wexner owned and sometimes lived in. And there's allegations they were likely lovers, but hey, who's got time for all this trash, right? His name is Leslie Herbert Wexner, age 88 years old, lives in Dayton, Ohio. Who was his father, you ask? Well, always a key thing to ask with these people. His father, Harry Wexner, born in the Russian Empire, territory that today is often described as part of Eastern Europe. Well, I'll be darned. Who could have guessed, right? Immigrated to the U.S. as a child, opened a small retail clothing store in Ohio. His mother, Bella Kabakafi, also from a Jewish immigrant family, Eastern European Jewish heritage. I have to say, we have some gypsies on our hands here. At the time they immigrated in the early 20th century, they came from what is now known as Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania, and they were all part of the Russian Empire. So I keep wanting to call him Les, for Leslie, another gender neutral name, right? He married a woman named Abigail. Abigail, listen, I wouldn't have the intelligence or imagination to make all this stuff up. So the woman that I'm presuming she's a woman, okay? The woman that Les Wexner is married to is named Abigail. Where'd she come from, you ask? Well, she was born to Polish parents, and much of her family traces back to Europe and the Middle East. Her father, Yehuda, was born in Kaliza, Poland, left at 16, and later resettled in Palestine. Oh, isn't that just fascinating? It's unclear precisely how Les met his partner, Abigail. Yet we do know they have an Israeli connection through his philanthropy and his father opening the first it's ELAL, Israeli airline ticket office in New York. The couple thus tied the knot in his home state of Ohio on January the 23rd, 1993. Well, Abigail was 31 and he was 55. And when I was digging through the files, um, I haven't spent much time on the Epstein thing because, well, I'm not. I started looking into it years ago. Not that much to look into, right? So, um, but here's something fascinating that I pulled out of it. I was listening to a victim story, and they were talking about his past, and they were saying, "Do you know why he wanted children with so many women? Was it his belief, like a eugenics concept? And what did he think about this?" And this is what they said. I'm going to quote you directly. He just obsessed with the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. He saw himself as grandiose, like Sultan King, like person character. That's what he wanted. Like he talked about it every day. I don't know if it's so much as having, yeah. So anyway, so Epstein envisioned himself, he was obsessed with the Ottoman Empire. Funny thing, huh? To find the occult meanings of Israel, you need to split the name Israel into three names. After you do this, the name Israel becomes Israel. The name, the, the is represents the ancient goddess Isis, and the name represents the ancient god Ra. As for the name El, it represents the ancient god El, also known as Kronos, the god of time, Saturn, Saturnus, Pan, and the Lord of the Rings. In ancient Egypt, Ra or Re was also recognized as a sun god. The proper pronunciation is Ra or Re, hence the word sun ray or sun ray. He was also known as Amen, Amen. You know what Christians say? He was known as Amen Ra and the Lord of the underworld. Ra, Amen, Ra is the ancient God that Christians acknowledge when they say Amen at the end of their prayers. And two symbols that are often associated with the ancient god El, Saturn, is the Star of David and the black cube, which I talked about earlier. The black square can also be found in the teachings of Islam. Have you ever heard of the sacred black cube of Mecca called the Kabash or Kaaba? This sacred black cube that Muslim pilgrims to represent the god Saturn, which also means Satan. The black mortar board, the hat that high school and college students wear when they graduate, also symbolizes the god Saturn. Saturn, which means Satan, was and is still such an important god that today we dedicated a day for Saturn, which is known as Saturn Day or Saturday. It's right in your face. Saturn is also known as the Lord of the Ring. When people get married today, they use the ring as a symbol for their marriage. What they do not realize is the symbol of the ring symbolizes the god Saturn. This is the origin of the ring ritual that people do when they get married. What you need to know about rituals is that they have energetic binding forces attached to them. These binding forces are not dependent upon personal knowledge or beliefs. By simply taking the action to perform the religious ring ritual, you consent to whatever the ring ritual is designed to do. So, when was the earliest use of Satan in Judaism? The Hebrew word Satan, Satan, simply means adversary, accuser, opponent. It was originally a role, not a proper name. Christian theology then identified Satan with the serpent in Genesis. You know, those serpents that doctors and nurses wear on their logos? Yeah, that's serpent. Linking him with Lucifer from Latin translation of Isaiah. Defined him as a fallen angel leading a cosmic rebellion. This systematized the idea of Satan as the embodiment of evil. Ancient Judaism or Israelite religion, but as a functional title, not the later Christian devil. So the Christians made Satan the devil, right? And I'm going to be reading some portions of an article. I have the complete article listed down below or over my website. In the interview, later published as The Hidden Tyranny, the arrogant Rosenthal, they're talking about a person named Rosenthal, belligerently boasts on tape that the Jewish people have fabricated certain falsehoods which work to conceal their nature and protect their status and power. Rosenthal debunks the common accepted lie that the Jews are Israelites and thus God's chosen people. The secret of the ancient Egyptians and their modern disciples, the Freemasons, is the art of demonology for gaining power, mainly through the devil, Jehovah. As the article points out, Jehovah and Elohim are not the same God. Jehovah is Satan, and the Jews do indeed worship Satan. Sigmund Freud's book, Moses and Monotheism, points out that Jehovah was a volcano god who shunned the light. Jesus himself said to the Jews, "You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you will do." He was a murderer from the beginning, and he stood not in truth, but truth is not in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh his own, for he is a liar and the father thereof. And that comes from John 41 to 44. Most Jews do not like to admit it, but our God is Lucifer. So I wasn't lying, and we are his chosen people. Lucifer is very much alive, said Harold Rosenthal. Most Jews don't even know this. The prayers in modern synagogues are nothing more than disguised demonic invocations. They're hypnotic spells, similar to the Enochian language of the Church of Satan. The reason for anti Semitism is that Judaism is defined by Kabbalism, a satanic cult whose aim is to possess humanity. Using central banking and Freemasonry as their instruments, Kabbalist Jews have taken control of the world. Communism, socialism, liberalism, feminism, Zionism are just masks for this agenda. And I'm reading from his quote. The question is so urgent that I am reprising this 2010 article. Is Lucifer the God of Judaism by Will Newman, a fellow Jew who describes the satanic symbols and rituals of Judaism? Rosenthal said in part, most Jews do not like to admit it, but our God is Lucifer, so I wasn't lying. And we are his chosen people. Lucifer is very much alive, and that is a direct quote from the Hidden Tyranny. Lucifer's goal is to be like the Most High and to usurp the worship of God. Of course, Mr. Rosenthal was a member of an elite, openly satanic minority among the Jewish people. Everyday Jews do not know that the God of their faith is, in fact, Satan hiding behind a mystical name. It is of no consequence to Satan whether he is worshipped deliberately or through subtle lies and deceptions. An agreement was forged between the Jewish Masoretes and the Catholic Church around 1000 AD to change the name of God in the Hebrew Old Testament to the pagan name Yahweh, Jehovah, via the Tratagram. So, yeah, I've talked extensively about all this. This explains Rosenthal saying, we are amazed by the Christian stupidity in receiving our teachings and propagating them as their own. In Henry Ford's words, the Christians cannot read his Bible except through Jewish spectacles, and therefore reads it wrong. Lucifer's purpose is to deceive the whole world by transforming himself into an angel of light. This is best exemplified by the Freemasons. Their motto of making good men better produces a far more favorable public image than the most accurate alternative: how to become demon possessed in 33 easy steps. The Jewish and Masonic religions both worship the same God, Lucifer. In the Jewish Encyclopedia, Adonai, Adonai, and Baal, Baal, reveals the name Baal apparently as an equivalent to the Yahweh one. Since the days of Jeremiah, the Jews have forgotten their God's name and replaced it with the title Baal, or the Yahweh. And people used to tell me that. I never studied the Bible. I hear from people, they say, Diane, those of us on the inside, well, we know the name is Yahweh because we got the inside track. Well, all of those people, well, I don't think any of those people were lying to me on purpose, but people feel like, well, I got the sacred knowledge and it's Yahweh. Well, you got tricked, is what I got to tell you. Let me keep reading here. Young Jews spend countless hours preparing for their bar mitzvah, which consists of memorizing long chants and proper cadence and tone. Most who complete the bar mitzvah will not be able to translate more than a handful of words. These young men and women have no idea what they are saying or to whom they are praying. Jews are invoking demons named Adonai, Elohim, El Shaddai, Zabbat in their rituals. And this stuff is all 100% true. I'd like to encourage you, block your energy. The only reason I've survived for this long is my energy is blocked. All the chants they're doing is so toward me, I got them all blocked. Block your own energy. They're using that to take people down. So, vain repetitions and head bobbing during Jewish prayers aid the entrance into a trance state. Large numbers of atheistic Jews engage in this pseudo religious worship of status and knowledge. It's called the worship, which is a lot different from study, of knowledge, science, or technology, is Satanism in its purest form, and its god Lucifer fills its members with the same satanic powers as the Church of Satan and Freemasonry. So, what about Egypt? The connections between Egyptian mystery schools and Freemasonry, they connect like two hands in a glove. Albert Pike, in his book Morals and Dogma, on page 624, refers to the ancient mysteries and Freemasonry as being identical, with exceptions found only in that of progressive altercations. Egypt has always been considered the birthplace of the mysteries. It was there that the ceremonies of initiation were first established. It was there that truth was first veiled in allegory and that dogmas of religion were first impacted under symbolic forms. And you'll find that all came from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry under the heading Egyptian Mysteries. So we have found that Masonic symbols and legends derive from people anterior to the Solomonic Temple. In Egypt, there is a major source of this. It all comes from Egypt. Osiris was the chief god, no, excuse me, Osiris, Osiris, was a chief god of Egypt, the son and husband of Isis. Osiris is said to have been killed by his jealous brother Tiffany by trickery. Osiris was nailed in a chest and cast into the Nile. Later, his dead body was cast up Biblios in Phoenicia and left at the foot of the tamarind tree. Isis revived his body only to lose it again to the jealous brother, who then cut him into 14 pieces, which he scattered around the kingdom. Isis again went in search of Osiris and found all the body parts except the phallus, which had been eaten by a crab in the Nile. And who else makes up these crazy stories? Well, the Bible, right? I'll keep reading. Isis was then made a phallus, which was to be sacred, and that was the origin of the obelisks that are everywhere, those big phallus symbols. She embalmed him, thus claiming restoration, and gave rise to the concept that the immortality of the soul was dependent on the preservation of the body, which is totally not true. They can destroy our bodies all they want, our soul lives on. So I'll keep reading. Osiris was afterwards known as the Lord of the Underworld. He was also god of the sun and god of fertility, worshipped in orgastic sex rituals. The most blatant symbols of Freemason obsession with Egypt are not hidden in the temples. They stand on public view in the center of London, Paris, New York, and Washington. And that is those obelisks, also phallic symbols. How they came to be erected shows both the immense power of Freemasons in the 19th century and their love affair with the most evocative symbol of all Egyptian religion, the obelisk. So the obelisk is considered the most evocative symbol of all Egyptian religion. Kind of a big deal, just like ISIS, right? That's why ISIS is all over. So, why the obelisk? To early Egyptians, it was the shape sacred to the sun god, Re or Ra, the creator of humanity, the source of all heat and light, the being upon whom man was totally dependent. By the fifth dynasty, Re had become so popular he was elevated to the role of state deity. His main center of worship was on Heliposis, where the first kings erected primitive obelisks, rough hewn and truncated. but tipped off with the pyramidal shape which distinguished obelisks from other monumental columns. These prototype obelisks were also known as Ben stone, Ben stone. The spirit of the sun god was supposed to enter the stones at certain periods, and on these occasions, human sacrifices were offered to it. The victims were probably prisoners of war who had been captured, and foreigners who these failed. The priests must have drawn upon the native population. There's always these priests in there, right? So Egypt has the original obelisk. Turkey, keep your eyes on Turkey, has the obelisk of Thermodius in Istanbul, and it was originally Egyptian. Rome, home of the Roma. Rome contains the largest number of Egyptian obelisks outside of all of Egypt. And who else has obelisks? Well, funny you should ask. The Gulf, the Gulf monuments. The Gulf has come up, the Gulf states have come up with modern interpretations of the obelisk. So let's look at a couple of these. I've talked about these in the past, but let's put it all into context here. In London, we have Cleopatra's Needle, original date 1450 BCE. It was moved to London in 1878. It was originally erected in Helipolis, Egypt, gifted to Britain in 1819 by Mohammed Ali Pasha. Transported and installed during the height of the British Empire. Pretty close connection, right? So, what was the meaning in 19th century Britain? Well, imperial prestige. We rule where Rome ruled. Classical legitimacy for a global empire. It was a Victorian imperial trophy. And it also appears in Washington, D.C., the Washington Monument, completed in 1884, 555 feet, tallest masonry structure in the world at completion. This is not Egyptian, it is an obelisk shaped monument built in neoclassic style. So, why this shape? Because in 18th and 19th century Europe and America, obelisks symbolized permanence. They were associated with Rome. Rome was associated with republican virtue and imperial power. So, the American founders were heavily influenced by Roman Republican symbolism, Enlightenment architecture, and neoclassical design language. So then we have obelisks in Rome, what they call the real hub. Rome contains more Egyptian obelisks than anywhere outside Egypt. And let me see. Because Roman empires conquered Egypt, they imported obelisks as proof of imperial dominance. They reinstalled them in circuses and public squares. Later, the Catholic Church re erected many during the Renaissance as symbols of triumph over pagan Rome, markers of papal authority. But they're still using the same satanic symbols, right? They just reword things. So, how do London and Washington add up? Well, Egypt invented the obelisk, the solar cult of Ra and royal power. Rome conquers Egypt and imports them. Renaissance Europe revives Roman architecture. British Empire copies Rome's imperial aesthetic. United States copies classical Republican Rome. So, the City of London Corporation did not build Cleopatra's Needle. It 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 just installed it. Let me see here. Yeah. Anyway, that's enough for that. But anyway, so there's really only two groups of people we're talking about. Both groups are using two different names. I believe they're all Romas or Gypsies. And let me show you just a little bit of a comparison here. The Jews in Europe and beyond, through European history, they had blood libel accusations, claims of ritual murder, host desecration myths. They're accused of financial conspiracy narratives. The Jews were also accused of the Dreyfus Affair, state level anti Semitic framing. They were also accused in Nazi racial propaganda. And that was a pretty clever trick because by making them the targets of the Nazis made them the ultimate victim, right? So governments sometimes intervened to protect Jewish communities. At other times, governments were the persecutors, okay? And they did those fought blood libel accusations, ritual murder. That was the Jews, okay? The Roma in Europe, Roma populations have faced criminality myths, child kidnapping folklore, vagrancy stereotypes, Nazi genocide, and post war discrimination. So, yes, both of them. So, who are these people? Well, the Khazarians were a warlike tribe who lived deep in the heart of Asia. They were so warlike, even the Asiatics drove them out of Asia into Eastern Europe. Ding, ding, ding. Then they finally then they were finally wiped out by the forces of Genghis Khan. However, evidence indicates that the Khazars themselves migrated to Poland and formed the cradle of the Western Ashkenazi Jewry. In Eastern Europe, they set up a giant Khazar kingdom which spanned over 800,000 square miles. Ashkenazi or Ashkenaz Jews are the largest identifiable Jewish culture where ancestry goes back to Eastern Europe. Although local churches were required by law to keep records of the general population, and this is where the trick just goes off the walls in sneakiness, okay? Here's how it all worked. Now remember, the Romans kept no written records, which was a very clever move, right? So, under the Jewish people, J- Jewish congregations created their own records and kept them in their own custody. Very, very clever and very, very convenient. So, when records became, I was asking the question, why records became sketchy. Well, when Jewish congregations kept their own records separate from church mandated civil registries, several consequences followed. None of them nefarious, all of them were structural. So, no single archival authority. In most of Christian Europe, churches are places for civil registries, baptisms, birth, marriage, legal unions, burial, and death. But for Jews, the synagogues record the births, the marriages, and the deaths. And these records were kept locally, written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Judo German, the early Yiddish, not always duplicated for state authorities. So, no centralized archival compared to parish systems. Very, very convenient, if you ask me. The records did exist, but they were not standardized. Christian parishes were often mandated by church of councils, standardized in format, periodically inspected by higher authorities. Jewish communal records, on the other hand, varied by town, rabbinical authority, and era. They used different dating systems. They used the Hebrew calendar. They often emphasized religious status, not civil identity. And the result, historians face gaps, incompatible formats, and uneven survival. And I would say that was a pretty good trick. So, because Jewish communities were legally autonomous in many regions, they also lacked trust in external authorities. They faced expulsions, pogroms, faced conversions, and confiscations. They often kept private, mobile, or hidden. So the result, the records were lost during the expulsions. The records were destroyed in violence or never handed over to state archives. So even when good records existed, there were medieval expulsions. England 1290, France repeatedly, Iberia and Spain 1492, which is another interesting date. They were the last time the Jews and Gypsies were kicked out of Spain in 1492. Just happened to be the time they supposedly found this place, right? So many lies, so little time. So so even where good records existed, They lost them when they had these expulsions, and they had the early modern programs where the Jews were run out of town, allegedly. And then they have the 20th century destruction, especially the Holocaust. These wars are just a treasure trove of ways to destroy records, right? Hey, we're going to have another war. Let's get rid of the records from the last one. Okay, this is why you also see phrases like poorly documented, sparse early records, reconstruct your genealogies. These usually mean records once existed but did not survive intact. So, historians rely on indirect reconstruction. Because of this, scholars often reconstruct Jewish history using tax rolls, court cases, notary records, trade guild disputes, cemetery inscriptions, literature. That's very different from flipping through parish books. So, partial record systems explain a lot of the difficulty. The Christian the Christians in Europe centralized, they had state-aligned church records and continuity. The Jewish communities were autonomous, community-held records and vulnerable. And they had separate custody, non-standard forms, language barriers, repeated displacement and violence. Boy, that's a good way to get rid of all those records now, wasn't it? Now let's take a look at the Ashkenazi Jewish records. Local laws, policies, and customs forced the Ashkenazi into certain occupations. For example, in many places, they were prohibited from owning land or engaging in certain occupations, so they tended to engage in specific businesses. In some cases, government strongly suggested or mandated that the country's predominantly religion had to record their information for taxation and census purposes. But compliance was often lax, and Jewish vital events may have been recorded in separate sections or not at all. Meanwhile, the Ashkenazi maintained their own records, language, and internal government, education structures, and cemeteries. All you have to do is research for the Eastern European Jewish community, and you can include many languages, cultures, and records. And there was a long time that the Ashkenazis did not even have last names. Boy, what a way to trick people, right? Further confusing research is that the Ashkenazium did not adopt consistent surnames until recent times. Can't keep a good criminal down. Until the early to mid 1800s, yeah, about the time they took over, right? They followed a patronymic system. The child's first name was followed by either Ben, B-E-N, or Bat, son of or daughter of, respectively, and then the father's name, mother's name, or both. For example, Aaron ben Joseph would be the son of Joseph. Rachel Bat Benjamin would be Benjamin's daughter. By the late 1700s and early to mid 1800s, the Ashkenazi Jews in Poland, Germany, and Austro Hungary were forced to take surnames. In genealogical terms, this is a relatively recent trend limiting the time period for researchers by surname. Yeah, I kind of threw a bailiwick in there, right? You didn't have their names, you didn't have their records. How are you going to accuse them of anything, right? So let me give you a couple of definitions. There's a word called Sanguineous marriages, Consanguineous marriages. Consanguineous marriages are unions between individuals who share a common ancestor, leading to a higher degree of genetic similarity. This practice has been common in many cultures and is often linked to cultural, social, and economic factors. The most common form of consanguineous union globally are between first cousins, where spouses share approximately 12.5% of their genetic material. In some regions, such as North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of South Asia, consanguineous unions can account for 20% to over 50% of all marriages. The practice is rare in Western and European nations where it occurs less than 5%. So 50% of cousin marriages in your country is a pretty big deal. Consanguineous comes from the Latin word with the same blood. It is a neutral technical term used in anthropology, demography, genetics, public health, and law. But continuity does not equal incest. Incest is a legal moral category. So, commonly for shorthand, you'll see cousin marriage, first cousin marriage, or endogamous kin marriage. But really, you're just looking at cousin to cousin marriage. All these other names just kind of confuse the whole picture. So, but core genetic reality, consanguinity does not cause new mutations. It concentrates existing recessive mutations. The harm appears after multiple generations, not immediately. So, why did the Ashkenazi Jews sound the alarm now? Because the Ashkenazi Jewish population experienced centuries of extreme endogamy, marriage within a small, closed population, driven by legal segregation in Europe, geographic isolation, the ghettos, religious infamy. So the result, certain rare recessive disorders became statistically common, including the Tay-Sachs disease, Canavan disease, familiar diasodia, blood syndrome, and Gaucher disease. Because of this, genetic screening programs were developed in the late 1970s to 1990s. Today, Ashkenazi communities are very explicit and public about their genetic risk. So, why do Gulf states and parts of Africa appear fine for now? In many Gulf and Africa societies, first cousin marriage is common and socially recent. The mutation load has not yet fully compounded. Severe outcomes often appear as infant mortality, not counted as deformity. They are then misclassified as God's will, infection, or birth classification. They go unrecorded due to weak surveillance systems. So, I'm just taking a guess at some of these generations. What happens generation 1 to 2? Well, 1 to 2 is the generation we're at right now in the Gulf states, and that shows minimal visible effects. Generation 3 and 4, sharp rise in congenital disorders. Generation 5 plus, population level crisis unless patterns change. Ashkenazi Jews are effectively generation 8 to 12. So many Gulf state populations are generation 2 to 3. So they're ways behind the Ashkenazi group. The Ashkenazi Jewish genetic disorders are a warning signal, not an anomaly. They show what happens when contiguity persists long enough. Gulf states and parts of Africa are earlier on the same curve. Public health consequences lag cultural practices by decades. That is why geneticists, not activists, are the ones raising alarms quietly, clinically, and with some math. So, medical and genetic research groups raising alarms on these cousin marriages. Scientific investigations began in the 1950s, not that long ago. I was born in 1951. So, up until the 1950s, nobody knew anything, right? Or so the story goes, right? And then public health concern and policy discussions began in the late 1970s to 1980s. And I would think in the Gulf, they probably started getting the alarm bells around the 2000s. So, anyway, so 1950s, human genetic emerges as a formal discipline after World War II. Researchers began documenting recessive inheritance in isolated cases. Early case reports note higher rates of rare disorders. So by the 1960s, they're just buzzing along, right? But then the 1970s, larger birth defect registries become available. Researchers begin publishing comparative risk ratios. So they didn't really know much about this. In the 1980s, who are you going to call? Linked researchers began referencing cousin marriages, especially in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. So they started noticing these things. I traced it back to, well, who are you going to call? Started ringing the bells around the 1980s. So hospitals in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE began publishing hospital-based prevalence studies, family cluster analysis. The link between cousins rate is 25 to 50, and inherited disease burden becomes statistically undeniable. So yes, in the early 2000s, the Gulf states introduced premarital screening programs. That is a big alarm bell. When you introduce premarital screening programs in your country, which Saudi Arabia did in 24, they introduced mandatory screening for some conditions. Medical genetic societies began issuing formal statements. Language started shifting. I started noticing these files. It went from association to preventable disease burden. So yeah, and the 2010s, yeah, by 2021, the Saudi Society of Medical Genetics explicitly frames cousin marriage as a driver of high genetic disease incident and a future systemic risk, not just a clinical concern. And that was in 2021. This is the first time the issue is publicly discussed as long term, population level, and requiring sustained interventions. So, yeah, so 1950s, first scientific recognition, 1970s to 80s, epidemiology confirmation, 1990s, regional documentations in the Gulf, 2000s policy and screening programs, 2010s to 2020 open institutional warnings about future burdens. So by the 1950s, geneticists knew if a population maintains a high cousin marriage for multiple generations and infant mortality declines, that then inherited disease burdens will rise. So yeah, that's exactly. I'm going to get off of this because I've said enough, but I have all much more detail, every bit of detail you want to know about this on my webpage site. So I think the first one that I found was Oman. They crossed early relative to its size, and Kuwait. Kuwait they figured out in the mid 2000s. Qatar mid 2000s. Qatar crossed later, not because of lower risk, because detection took longer. So yeah, I got every detail you want to know about this stuff because this to me is very, very interesting. So, and that is why they're now leaning toward IVF. Um, IVF is widely used, but almost always with the married couple's own. But see, remember, we're taking information from a group of people, psychopaths, who have no conscience and are known to be liars, right? So I'm going to be going past some of this information. I have every bit of it down below. I think this. Here's what I think. Are they still having their own babies in the Gulf? Maybe. Are they having them through IVF and surrogacy? Yeah, highly likely. Because why go through the effort of birth if you can just have your money pay it for you, right? So I think what they're looking at is this, and I am just merely guessing here, right? I think their concern is this. Their concern is likely because their surrogate population is now so polluted that it is not worth really bringing back. So that's why I think is going on because I don't think these sultans, these people are. Oh, I didn't finish with that sultan guy. You know that sultan guy in the Epstein files. He's not a sultan. Sultan is his name. But anyway, so let me keep moving along here. So yeah, most Gulf countries restrict these technologies, meaning IVF. And they say we restrict them. It's not according to law. Well, yeah, they say a lot of things, right? Um, so genetically speaking, Saudi nationals, Qataris, Emiratis function as small, semi-closed populations, even when living in mega cities. So yeah, there's not that many of them, right? Um, So every way you want to cook this thing, I got it down. Take a look. So let's take a look who has the highest rates, and here's where it gets really interesting. So first cousins share grandparents, so their children have higher genetic risk. That is inbreeding, even if society says it's allowed. Who is the highest in the world? Well, Pakistan actually, 61%. Kuwaiti, 54%. Qatar, 54. UAE, 50. Sudan, 50. South Sudan, 50. Afghanistan, 49. Mauritania, 47. Iraq, 46. Yemen, 44. Iran, 39. Yeah, that whole area has just really got it right. So it goes down. Saudi Arabia, interestingly enough, is only 38.9. Libya, 37. So it goes all the way down. Syria, you got 35% of cousin marriages. And Israel, 10%. What do they know that everybody else doesn't know, right? So, yeah. And this part has all been documented by who you going to call. So, what happened was that before there was Sykes-Picot in the Middle East to break that territory up, they broke up Africa first, okay? So, by the time Britain and France drew the Middle East, they already knew this system worked. They refined it for oil, ports, and trade routes. They layered in royal families and mandates instead of overt conquest. So Sykes-Picot looks cleaner because fewer rival European powers were involved and more centralized targets, oil and all that, and better PR. But the logic is identical. Africa. Africa remains the clearest case because decolonization was rushed and incomplete. Borders were never renegotiated. External powers kept influence via debt, arms, and resource contracts. But they changed the script around what they did in the Middle East. They didn't repeat what they did in Africa because it wasn't really all that effective, right? So and they were only 31 to 32 years apart. The Berlin Conference, which allowed for the destruction of Africa, was 1884 to 1885. Sykes-Picot was 1960. So that gave it about 31 years between the two of them. And that's only really one generation. Enough time for European powers to test, partition, indirect rule, and all the extraction in Africa, and then reapply the same machinery to the Middle East with refinements. So, yeah, that's how I see it working. Always remember, they always want to guide us into hearing about history starting in the middle. History contains the beginning, the middle, and the end. Like, for example, with those orphan train children, I'm 100% sure those children were taken by the Romanovs in two different impacts. But they were taken and they got rid of all their records. You notice the patterns here, right? So anyway, so I'm not going to stay on that subject. I have to get back to the orphan train children. All those orphan train children, the majority, the vast majority, I would say, came out of Russia. They were Crusacians, and the other group came out of Armenians. And never forget this, the Armenians were disarmed before they were genocided. It didn't happen in one swoop. Like, in other words, the Armenians didn't say, oh, yeah, you want our weapons? Here, we'll give them to you. No, they were tricked into giving up their weapons. So if you think you should not have weapons right now, well, I think you better be thinking very, very carefully. How are you going to protect your family? But anyway, so I'm going to get off this subject. I think I have said about all I'm going to say on that part of it. So let me scroll down here for a second. So I believe um, connecting it to MBS, it was the state there was created in 1932, a ruler in only the true second generation. So yeah, so I think we're only talking two generations over in that region, but we don't know who was there before, right? It could be highly possible because when you search for, well, is it possible that the Romanovs and these people wound up over in the Middle East running the oil? What you'll find, they'll say, well, why would they do that? They've already got these other better areas. Well, why wouldn't they do it, right? They say to their gypsy relatives, "Hey, we got a deal for you over in the Middle East. We're going to make you the richest people in the entire world. All you got to do is put on these turbans and these hats and all these costumes and stuff. We'll set you up over there in Saudi Arabia. You'll be the richest people in the entire world. But we got one downside. You're never going to be white. But you're going to be rich, but you're never going to be white." See how it works? So anyway, so I think they're only into their second generation. And actually, I'm not really that engaged in what's going on with them right now because hey, we're getting close to the end, right? And the rates are going up, not down. Um, so yeah, I think they put specific people as rulers, and that is exactly how it works. So in both Europe and the Middle East, lineage claims are curated. Unflattering branches just disappear. Favorable ancestors are emphasized, mishardened into history. So, yeah, I don't know. I would be quick to not just believe everything you read, but, what happened in the Middle East was different. Britain and France won. They dismantled the Ottoman system. They created the new ruling families. They replaced imperial administration with dynastic clients. They reintroduced pre modern rule under modern supervision. Britain and France had centuries of experience dealing with what happened with the Habsburgs. So, yeah, they knew going in what was going on. Now, did they pay attention to it? Those are two different issues. So, and of course, the victor writes the history. Why do you think it's called his story? So, they froze all of their stories during that time, right around World War One. Supposedly the Romanovs went away. Supposedly Habsburgs went away. None of them went anywhere. None of them were anywhere at all. I think what happened was they got downgraded, these royal people, and we'll see if they get downgraded further with these deal going on over in the UK right now. So people need to understand these are liars. They have always been liars. They have never, ever been there for your best interest. Not one point can I point to them and say, yeah, really good people. I got this wrong. They only meant good. No. Where do you think the name monarch comes from? From monarchy, right? Yeah, I think like I said earlier, everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? The end came for the Habsburgs and all those people around World War One. Then it brought about the Windsors and all those people. It's just been one big continuity. I would like to leave you with this one saying that I think is probably my favorite saying. Learn to discern. Those people on the screen, not your friends. If they're visible on the screen, they're highly likely they're on the team, right? That means big or small, they put the most charming ones in front of you. So I would recommend stop being so confused by these people. And where does it all start? Well, it starts when people start painting red flags white. Like, oh, well, this billionaire, he's a good billionaire, not like the other ones. So my message to you today is learn to stand in solidarity to the rest of us. We're here. We matter. We're speaking. And stop painting red flags white. Be safe out there and goodbye for now.